Greetings everyone. This is Muse Fanfiction. Prepare yourselves for, what if Harry used his 20 lordship rings to purchase every ministry department and fired Fudge before age 11? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Counting of Rings. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Harry Potter had been expecting it, in the vague way you expect something you've been told about but never quite believed, like Father Christmas, or the idea that adults always know what they're doing. He'd heard Dudley mention Hogwarts exactly once, overheard his aunt hiss at his uncle to keep it quiet, and filed it away in the back of his mind the way he filed everything important, carefully, silently, without letting anyone know he'd done it. What he hadn't expected was the second letter. It arrived the same morning, tucked beneath the Hogwarts envelope like something embarrassed to be seen. The parchment was heavier, the seal different, not wax but something that looked almost like compressed smoke, shaped into a grasping hand holding a set of scales. He recognized it instinctively, the way you recognize something from a dream. Gringotts Bank. The return address was printed in characters that shifted slightly when he tried to look directly at them, as though the letters themselves weren't entirely committed to being read. He took both letters upstairs before Uncle Vernon came down for breakfast. The Hogwarts letter he set aside. He'd read it later, he already knew roughly what it would say. The Gringotts letter he opened first, sitting cross-legged on his narrow bed in the cupboard under the stairs, holding it in both hands because his fingers had started doing something strange and electric he didn't quite have a name for yet. Mr. H. J. Potter, Lord of the ancient and noble houses of Potter and Black, and heir presumptive of 17 additional lordship titles currently held in trust under Gringotts Protectorate Charter 1147, is formally requested to attend a full inheritance assessment at his earliest convenience. As you are approaching your 11th year, the dormancy clauses on several of your held titles are due to expire. Gringotts Bank is obligated under magical law to inform you that the total value of assets currently administered under your guardianship without your knowledge or consent may constitute the largest single inheritance portfolio in British magical history. We further note, with professional neutrality, that several Ministry of Magic departments have been drawing upon your family's estate funds under emergency powers provisions that expired in 1983. The total amount drawn without authorization since that date comes to. Harry stopped reading. Not because he was shocked. He stopped reading because he needed a moment to make sure he was reading it correctly, to make sure the number printed at the bottom of that paragraph was real and not a smear of ink or a trick of the light through the cupboard slats. He read it again. 3 times. Then he put the letter down very gently, stared at the ceiling for approximately 30 seconds, and said, quietly and with great feeling, "Right." Getting to Diagon Alley required lying to the Dursleys, which Harry had become exceptional at. He told his aunt he'd been invited to a friend's house, which was technically impossible since he had no friends, but Petunia Dursley had a deep and abiding talent for not examining things she didn't want to examine. She handed him £2 from her purse without looking at him and went back to her garden. Vernon didn't even look up from his newspaper. Dudley called him a freak from the landing above. Harry didn't respond. He was already thinking about something else. He took the bus to the Leaky Cauldron because he'd read about it in a library book 2 years ago, an incomplete history of magical London, shelved in the folklore section where nobody ever looked, and because the letter had included simple directions written in very small, apologetic handwriting, as though whoever wrote them expected him not to need them. The pub materialized for him as soon as he looked directly at the gap between the sports shop and the record store, which was both exactly how the book had described it and somehow still surprising. He pushed the door open and walked in like he knew where he was going, which was a technique he developed early. If you look like you belong somewhere, people treat you like you do. The barman, Tom, according to the book, looked up from wiping the counter, took one look at Harry's face, and nearly dropped his rag. Merlin's. He caught himself. Mr. Potter. Sir. The back entrance to Diagon Alley, Harry said pleasantly. Could you show me, please? Tom showed him, tripping over himself slightly, and Harry walked through the archway into a world that hit him like a wave, color and noise and magic so thick in the air it felt like breathing something slightly different to oxygen. He stood still for exactly 3 seconds, let himself feel it, and then walked directly to Gringotts. The goblin who met him at the top of the marble steps was not the one who'd written the letter, but it had clearly been briefed. It looked at Harry with sharp amber eyes and said, without preamble, "You're earlier than expected." The letter said earliest convenience, Harry replied. "This is it." The goblin, whose name was Sharpblade, which Harry filed away carefully, made a sound that might have been approval or indigestion. "Follow me." The assessment room was deep inside the bank, past the carts and the vaults, in a part of the building that felt older and heavier than the rest, like the stone had been there since before human beings had worked out what stone was for. There was a stone table, 2 chairs, and a wooden box about the size of a shoebox sitting in the exact center of the table. "The inheritance assessment," Sharpblade said, taking the chair on one side of the table, "is conducted by blood ritual. You will need to provide 3 drops. The assessment will then generate the full picture of your holdings, titles, and any legal irregularities attached to your estate." The goblin's amber eyes flicked up. "There are, I should tell you, a significant number of legal irregularities." "I gathered," Harry said, sitting down. "You're not surprised." "I was surprised this morning. I've had a few hours." He paused. "I'm 10 years old and the ministry has apparently been stealing from my family for 8 years. I'm less surprised by that than you might expect." Sharpblade looked at him for a long moment. Then it produced a small silver knife and pushed it across the table without another word. The blood hit the assessment parchment and something happened that Harry would spend years trying to describe properly and never quite manage. The parchment lit up. Not glowing, exactly. It was more like the words were burning their way into existence from the inside, from somewhere very hot and very old, and the light they cast wasn't white or gold but the particular amber-orange color of something ancient and extremely awake. Names appeared first. Houses. Titles. House Potter, Lord, active. House Black, Lord, active, Sirius Black, convicted, rights suspended, under legal challenge. House Peveril, Lord, active, dormancy expired, July 31, 1991, House Gryffindor, Lord, active, dormancy expired, July 31, 1991, House Slytherin, heir presumptive, contested, House Hufflepuff, Lord, active, dormancy expired, July 31, 1991, House Ravenclaw, Lord, active, dormancy expired, July 31, 1991, Harry stopped counting around 14. He finished at 22. 22, he said. 20, Sharpblade corrected. 2 are contested and have not yet cleared the legal challenge process. You hold confirmed claim to 20 lordship titles. And what does that mean, practically? The goblin's expression suggested it respected the question deeply and was going to enjoy answering it. It means, practically, that you hold the largest single concentration of magical voting weight in Britain outside the Wisengamot itself. It means that your combined family vault holdings, once we subtract the amounts drawn without authorization, total approximately. Sharpblade named a number that Harry was fairly certain could have purchased several entire countries if the economy in question were small enough. And it means that several of the purchasing agreements your families made with the Ministry of Magic before their lines consolidated into yours are still legally active. Harry looked up from the parchment. What kind of purchasing agreements? Sharpblade smiled. On a goblin, this was not a comfortable thing to witness. Departmental patronage agreements. Your great-great-grandfather Peveril purchased what was then called structural influence over the Department of Mysteries in 1803. Your ancestor Ravenclaw, through the line that eventually became the Clearwater Consolidation, which reverted to you, purchased a controlling interest in what is now the Department of Magical Education in 1642. The goblin laid 6 more documents on the table. In total, you currently hold dormant but legally unbroken purchasing rights over 9 ministry departments, all of which can be reactivated at your request, provided you can demonstrate legal majority. I'm 10. You hold 20 lordship titles. Under the Ancient Rights Act of 1382, a witch or wizard holding 3 or more confirmed lordship titles is considered legally emancipated for the purposes of estate management and contractual engagement. The goblin looked at him steadily. You have held those rights since you were 1 year old, Mr. Potter. Nobody told you. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Harry breathed through it slowly. Then he picked up the nearest document and began to read. He was in Gringotts for 4 hours. At no point during those 4 hours did he raise his voice. At no point did he cry, which seemed to surprise Sharpblade and 2 additional senior goblins who joined the session around the 2-hour mark. He asked questions, specific, sharp ones, and when he didn't understand something he said so plainly and waited until it was explained. When he understood it, he moved on immediately and didn't need to be told twice. By the time he emerged into the pale afternoon sunshine of Diagon Alley, he had signed 47 documents, reactivated 9 dormant purchasing agreements, submitted 6 requests for legal investigation into ministry financial misconduct, and made 1 additional purchase using a fraction of his family's liquid vault holdings. That purchase was the controlling interest in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. He bought it because it was the department that had the most legal leverage over everything else. If you wanted to reshape a government, you didn't start with the parts that made noise. You started with the part that decided what was legal. He also had a meeting arranged for the following morning with the Minister for Magic. Sharpblade had offered to send a formal summons. Harry had declined, because a formal summons could be ignored, delayed, or buried under paperwork by a competent secretary. Instead, he'd asked Sharpblade to send a message worded in the specific legal terminology that meant Cornelius Fudge had no option but to attend without it technically being called a summons. Goblins, it turned out, were very good at that kind of thing. Cornelius Fudge arrived at Gringotts at 9 in the morning wearing his best lime green bowler hat and the expression of a man who had decided, on the walk over, that this was definitely going to be some kind of administrative misunderstanding easily resolved with a firm handshake and perhaps some sherbet lemons. He found Harry Potter waiting in a meeting room that was considerably nicer than the assessment room, actual carpet, a window that looked out on something that might have been countryside or might have been a painted illusion of it, water on the table in a crystal jug. Sharpblade sat to Harry's left. A senior Gringotts legal counsel named Hookthorn sat to his right. Across from them were 3 empty chairs. Fudge had brought his senior undersecretary, a woman named Millicent Bagnold who'd served 3 ministers and treated them all with the same efficient, slightly contemptuous competence. He'd also brought Percy Weasley's uncle, not Percy, who was 15 at the time, no, he'd brought one of his own undersecretaries, a broad nervous man named Hopkirk who handled financial irregularities with the practiced anxiety of someone who had spent years dealing with things he didn't want to know about. They sat down. Fudge smiled across the table, opened his mouth, and said, "Well, now, I'm sure whatever, I want to establish something before we begin," Harry said, and Fudge stopped mid-sentence, which seemed to surprise him as much as anyone. The boy across the table looked, on the surface, like exactly what he was, a small, thin, green-eyed child with untidy black hair and second-hand clothes and the particular stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was safer than movement. But his voice, when he spoke, had a quality that wasn't loudness or even authority exactly. It was certainty. The absolute lack of any doubt that what he was about to say was true. I hold 20 lordship titles. Gringotts has confirmed this. Those titles, under the Ancient Rights Act of 1382 and several subsequent charters, constitute full legal emancipation for estate management purposes. I am also, as of yesterday afternoon, the controlling stakeholder in 9 ministry departments through legally unbroken purchasing agreements. Harry placed a document in the center of the table. These are the Gringotts audit findings from yesterday's assessment. They detail 8 years of ministry financial activity that constitutes a legal drawdown on my family's estate funds. The total amount is on page 4. He paused. I'd suggest reading page 4 before anything else. Nobody spoke. Hopkirk turned to page 4, read it, and went the color of old porridge. Fudge picked up the document with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to look comfortable holding things he hadn't read yet. He turned to page 4. He read it. A very strange series of expressions crossed his face in rapid succession: disbelief, then the specific calculation of someone trying to work out how bad this was, then something close to panic dressed up in the clothing of affront. "This is," he said, "clearly an administrative error of some." "It isn't," Harry said, still pleasantly. "It's 8 years of unauthorized drawdowns under emergency powers provisions that expired in 1983. The signatures on the drawdown requests are ministry-issued. Several of them belong to the Auror office. Several others belong to a budget oversight committee that stopped holding meetings in 1984 but continued to sign documents until last year." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm not here to prosecute anyone this morning, Minister. I'm here because I want to resolve this efficiently." Fudge put the document down. His undersecretary, Bagnold, had been reading a copy of her own that Hookthorn had slid across to her, and her expression had progressed past affront into something that looked very much like professional respect, though you'd have had to know her face to recognize it. "What exactly," Fudge said, with the careful enunciation of a man working out where the ground was, "do you want, Mr. Potter?" "Several things," Harry said. "In order. First, Gringotts will begin managing the full restitution process for the unauthorized drawdowns. The ministry has 5 years to repay the principal from operating budgets, not from public taxation. Second, the 9 departments where my families hold controlling interests will operate under a joint governance model, ministry administrators in day-to-day roles, Gringotts appointed auditors with quarterly review rights. Third, and here Harry reached into his bag and placed a second document on the table, I'm purchasing 3 additional ministry departments today. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, the Office for the Detection and Confiscation of Counterfeit Defensive Spells, and the Department of International Magical Cooperation." The room had gone very quiet. "That's 12 departments," Bagnold said, not with hostility but with the careful precision of someone who needed to know the exact number of the things standing in front of them. "Yes. Out of how many total?" 17. Harry met her eyes. "I'm leaving 5 under full ministry control. I'm not trying to run the government. I'm trying to make sure the parts of it that touch my family's assets are properly overseen, and to recoup 8 years of theft through productive partnership rather than legal action." He paused. "Legal action would take longer and would be considerably messier for everyone involved, including several people in this room." Fudge sat very still. He was not, Harry had realized in the first 5 minutes, a stupid man. He was a political man, which was different, which meant he understood leverage and reputation and the specific arithmetic of how a story might look in the morning papers. He was working that arithmetic right now behind his eyes, and Harry could see the moment it resolved. "The 5th condition," Fudge said. "You said several things. You've listed 3. Conditions 4 and 5. Harry had wondered if he'd catch that. 4. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement operates under the joint governance model immediately, and its first action will be a formal review of all Auror case files relating to Sirius Black. He said the name without any particular weight, just placed it in the room matter-of-factly, and watched 3 faces react differently. Fudge's tightened, Bagnold's went momentarily unreadable, Hopkirk's just continued being anxious in a slightly different way. He was convicted without a trial. I'm aware that this was technically legal under the emergency provisions of the war period. I want that case reviewed under normal evidentiary standards. And 5? Fudge's voice had dropped half a register. Harry looked at him steadily. 5 is personal, Minister. As of this morning, I am the controlling stakeholder in 12 ministry departments and a legal partner in the oversight of 5 more. Under the joint governance clauses, those agreements require countersignature from the relevant executive authority of the ministry. He placed a third document on the table. That document is a motion of no confidence in your current management of the ministry's financial oversight structures. It's been co-signed by Gringotts as institutional creditor, which gives it legal standing independent of the Wisengamot. He gave Fudge a moment, just a breath. If you countersign the joint governance agreements and the restitution schedule, the motion is withdrawn. If you don't, it goes to the Wisengamot with the full Gringotts audit attached. Either way, the departments transfer. The only variable is whether you're still minister when that happens. It was not a threat. Harry had been careful about that, had spent the night reading the documents Hookthorn had prepared and calibrating every line. A threat could be answered with defiance. What he just offered was an exit with dignity, which was the thing most politicians wanted more than anything else, more even than power, the chance to have it be fine, to have the story come out tolerable, to not be the man who went down in history books as the one who was destroyed. Fudge picked up a quill. Set it down. Picked it up again. You're 10 years old, he said, not aggressively, more like he was stating it to himself, to establish some kind of orientation. I am, Harry agreed. I'll be 11 in July. Fudge looked at the document. Then he signed it. He signed all three. Cornelius Fudge was still technically Minister for Magic when he walked out of Gringotts that morning. But everyone in that room, and within 2 days, apparently everyone in the ministry, and within a week, apparently everyone in the magical world, understood that the title now meant something considerably different to what it had meant the day before. Harry ate lunch in the leaky cauldron by himself. He had chips and a butterbeer because he'd read about butterbeer and was curious, and it was everything the book had suggested, warm and slightly sweet, and the butterscotch notes were real, not just a name. He sat in a corner booth and watched the pub fill up around him and tried to work out how he felt. There was an odd feeling sitting in his chest that he spent some time identifying. It wasn't triumph, he'd expected it to feel like triumph and it didn't, quite. It was more like the sensation of putting something down you'd been carrying for a long time without knowing you were carrying it. Not relief, exactly. More like the discovery that your arms were stronger than you thought, that the weight had been doing something useful all along, building something in you that was now needed. Tom the barman brought him a second butterbeer without being asked and said, with the careful respect of a man who'd heard things through the pub wall already, "Will you be needing anything else, sir?" "No thank you," Harry said. "This is good." And then, because it was true and he thought it probably mattered to say true things when you could, "The chips are excellent." Tom beamed at that, apparently deeply gratified, and Harry turned back to his window. He still had the Hogwarts letter in his pocket. He read it now, properly, for the first time, and found that it said exactly what he'd expected: school supplies list, term dates, instructions about the Hogwarts Express. At the bottom, in handwriting that was loopier and more elaborate than the rest, someone had added, "We do so look forward to welcoming you this autumn. Hogwarts has waited a long time, Mr. Potter." He didn't know who'd added that. He suspected the headmaster, but he filed it under things to consider later and turned back to his chips. The door opened and 2 women came in, clearly witches from the way they handled their traveling cloaks, and one of them glanced across the pub and stopped dead. "Is that," she started. Her companion looked, and her eyes went wide, and Harry became aware that this was going to be a thing that happened now. He'd bought 12 government departments at age 10. The Gringotts clerks alone had probably told half of Diagon Alley by noon. He ate his chips. He didn't hide. He didn't perform ease either, he just was easy, because the alternative was to let other people's reactions become something he managed around, and he'd decided very early in the day that he wasn't going to do that. The women eventually sat down at a table across the pub and did a mediocre job of pretending they weren't watching him. He didn't mind. He found the bookshop almost by accident, Flourish and Blots, tucked between a robe shop and something that sold cauldrons in 17 different grades of quality, and went in because he needed the school books and also because it was a bookshop and he'd never been in one that didn't make him feel immediately better about whatever was happening. He had money now. He had access to his vault, the smallest of them, the one Gringotts had set up for his personal expenses, which even being the smallest of his holdings was enough to make Sharpblade's expression go briefly complicated when it told him the balance. He still felt faintly strange about it, like wearing someone else's shoes that happened to fit perfectly. He bought his school books. He bought 3 others that had nothing to do with school but caught his eye, a history of goblin-wizard relations that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, a book on magical contract law that was dry enough to serve as a doorstop but probably worth knowing, and a slim volume called The Architecture of Ancient Houses that he picked up because the cover had one of the seals he'd seen on his inheritance documents and he wanted to understand what it meant. The shopkeeper was trying very hard not to say anything notable. She wrapped his purchases in brown paper with slightly shaking hands and said, that is, shall I add it to an account, or, I'll pay now, Harry said, and gave her the Gringotts card sharp blade had pressed into his hand on the way out that morning. It was black, which he'd been told meant something, and the shopkeeper stared at it for about 3 seconds before putting it to the register. He was almost at the door when he heard it, not words, exactly, but a sound. The specific sound of someone trying very hard to be quiet about the fact that they were crying. He turned. The bookshop had a back corner, almost entirely dark, tucked behind a shelf of advanced magical theory textbooks that were apparently popular enough to be stocked in quantity but not popular enough that anyone was ever in that section. In the corner, sitting on the floor with her knees drawn up and a book open across them, was a girl about his age. Brown hair everywhere. Tears on her face that she was dealing with the way people deal with things when they don't expect to be seen, not quietly enough for true privacy, but quietly enough that in a busy shop on a busy day, nobody would notice. Harry noticed. He went over and sat on the floor next to her, which was a social gesture he suspected most people his age wouldn't have been able to make without awkwardness, but which seemed like obviously the right thing. Not close enough to crowd. Not far enough to be distant. "What are you reading?" he asked. She blinked at him, startled, and pulled the book close to her chest reflexively. Then she looked at him more carefully, and he watched her recognize him, the scar, the eyes, and watched her decide, visibly, not to say anything about that. "A History of Magic," she said, voice steady, just slightly thick. "By Bathilda Bagshot. It's on the school list." "I've got it." He patted his bag. "It's good. The chapter on the Statute of Secrecy is a bit dry but the section on Goblin Rebellions is excellent." She blinked again. "You've read it?" "I read it 2 years ago," Harry said. "Found it in the local library's mythology section. The copy there was missing the last 4 chapters, which was annoying. Did you know there was a 4th Goblin Rebellion in 1743 that basically nobody writes about because it ended in what the official record calls a negotiated peace, but Bagshot's footnotes suggest was actually the ministry agreeing to 3 major goblin demands and then trying to pretend it hadn't?" The girl had stopped crying. She was looking at him with the focused intensity of someone whose brain had made a decision that this was more interesting than whatever had just been happening emotionally. "I didn't know that," she said carefully. "Why don't the regular histories mention it?" "Same reason regular histories usually don't mention things, because the people writing them were the ones who'd have to look embarrassed." Harry looked at the book in her arms. "Is it bad at school?" She went very still. "What makes you think you're in a bookshop on your own?" he said, not unkindly. "Same age as me, so probably going to Hogwarts this year too. You're crying in the back corner where nobody can see." He paused. "I'm not asking to be nosy. I understand what it's like to be somewhere you're not exactly comfortable." She looked at him for a long moment. "The primary school I'm leaving," she said eventually. "The children there. They call me names because I read too much and I don't." She stopped. "It doesn't matter. I won't have to see them again." "No," Harry agreed. "You won't." He held out a hand. "Harry." "Hermione," she said, and shook it. Her grip was firm and immediate. "Are you Muggle-born?" he asked. "Yes. My parents are dentists." She said it with a particular briskness, like she was preempting a problem. "I've been told some wizarding families think that means 20 of my lordship titles have Muggle blood 3 generations back," Harry said easily. "Including House Potter. Magic doesn't care about blood quantum. Anyone who tells you otherwise is protecting a social structure that benefits them, not quoting a biological fact." He stood, offered her a hand up. Also, the magical world currently thinks I'm a bit alarming, so if you want, you can sit with me at the leaky cauldron and we can both be alarming together. Hermione Granger took his hand. She got to her feet, tucked a history of magic under her arm, and looked at him with those bright analytical eyes, and said, "You're not at all what I expected." "I get that a lot," Harry said, which was not strictly true as of that morning, but he suspected would become very true very quickly. He was right about that. They talked for 2 hours over tea that Hermione paid for because Harry offered, and she said firmly that she had her own money, thank you. He told her the broad facts of what had happened at Gringotts, watching her reactions cycle through disbelief, then rapid mathematical processing, then the particular expression of someone recalibrating their entire understanding of the situation. "So you legally own 12 departments," she said. "Controlling interests in 12. Partnership oversight in 5 more. Of 17 total." "Yes." And the minister signed all the documents. He had very limited alternatives. Hermione was quiet for a moment. "The Wiesengemot," she said. "The audit is going to them regardless, isn't it? Even with him signing." Harry looked at her. "Yes. So his signature just controlled how it looks for him politically. The restructuring was going to happen either way." "Yes." She picked up her tea. "Set it down. That's quite sophisticated for 10 years old." "I had good teachers," Harry said. "Mostly books." She smiled at that, a proper smile, unguarded, and it changed her face significantly. "Me too." She looked down at the table. "Will it work? The ministry? Will actually owning parts of it make it better?" Harry was quiet for a moment. He'd been asking himself that in the back of his mind all day. Not doubting the strategy, he was sure enough of the strategy, but honest about the limits. "I think it removes some of the worst incentives for corruption," he said finally. "If someone's drawing on your family's funds without permission, you can stop them more easily if you have legal authority than if you're just making complaints. But I don't think," he stopped, found the words. "I don't think buying something makes it yours, really. Not in the way that matters. The ministry's a culture more than it's an institution. And cultures are slower to change." Hermione looked at him with that focused expression again. "That's quite honest." "There's no point being anything else," Harry said. "Facts don't care whether you're honest about them." She left at 4 to meet her parents. At the door she turned back. "Hogwarts Express," she said. "September 1st. Platform 9 3/4. I know. I'll see you there," she said, with the decisive confidence of someone who had just made a decision that mattered and fully intended to follow through on it. After she left, Harry sat alone with his tea for a while longer. The pub had emptied out slightly in the late afternoon slump. The windows let in long yellow light. He thought about Fudge's face when he turned to page 4. He thought about Sharpblade's smile. He thought about 20 rings, not literal rings yet, he'd learn the tradition later, the physical rings were still in their cases in the vault, but 20 connections, 20 bloodlines, 20 histories of names and power and magic, all converging here, into this particular scar-faced boy in second-hand clothes sitting in a leaky cauldron booth with an empty butterbeer glass and a bag full of books. His family hadn't all been good people. He was already sure of that, the way you're sure of complicated things before you've read the evidence, just sure, in your gut, that 20 ancient houses would contain the full range of human failure. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But they were his. The names, the titles, the weight and responsibility of them, they were his, and whatever had been done with them before, and whatever was going to happen next, he was the one who'd be making those choices from here on out. He didn't feel afraid of that. He felt, for the first time in his life, in exactly the right place. Outside, Diagon Alley was still humming with the news of the day, snatches of conversation through the door every time it opened, people saying his name like it had suddenly acquired new texture, new dimensions. Not the boy who lived now, or not only that. Something else. Something with edges. Harry Potter gathered his books, left a galleon on the table, and walked out into the noise with his chin up and his eyes open and absolutely no intention of shrinking. The magical world could take a moment. It could catch its breath. It could work out how to feel about all of this. He had shopping left to do. Chapter 2, The Boy Who Bought the Daily Prophet headline the next morning read, Boy Who Lived Buys the Ministry, Fudge signs over 12 departments €2 10 LD which was technically inaccurate on 2 counts. Harry was 10, not 11, and he hadn't bought the ministry. He'd purchased controlling interests in 12 departments, which was a meaningfully different thing, but he'd been in the wizarding world long enough now, approximately 36 hours, to understand that accuracy and the Daily Prophet had a relationship best described as occasional. He read it over breakfast at the Leaky Cauldron, where Tom had given him the corner booth without being asked and brought tea and toast without being told and was doing an increasingly poor job of pretending this was all perfectly normal. Harry tipped him well, which seemed to produce a small crisis of gratitude that he left Tom to resolve privately. The article itself was written by a woman named Rita Skeeter, which was the kind of name that made you feel like you already understood something about the person. It was sensationalist in tone, light on verified facts, and heavy on phrases like unprecedented power grab and questions swirl about ministry stability. It also included, in the 14th paragraph, a fairly accurate summary of the Gringotts audit findings that suggested Skeeter had a source either inside the bank or very close to Fudge's office, neither of which was a comfortable thought. Harry cut out the 14th paragraph, folded it into his pocket, and left the rest. He spent the morning acquiring the remaining items on his school list because regardless of everything else, he still had to go to school and school still required a wand, robes, and an inexplicable number of pewter cauldrons. He did it efficiently, moving through Diagon Alley with the particular kind of focus that makes crowds part for you without being asked. He was stared at constantly. He acknowledged no one, not out of rudeness but because engaging with every person who wanted to either congratulate him or express concern or ask him to take a photograph would have consumed the rest of his summer. Madame Malkins was quiet when he entered, early enough that the post-breakfast rush hadn't started, and he was stepping up onto the measuring platform when the door opened and a boy came in with 2 adults behind him. The boy was blond, precise in his movements, with the particular expression of someone raised to believe that rooms belonged to them. The usual, the blonde boy said to Madame Malkin, which was the kind of sentence that only made sense if you'd been coming somewhere long enough that there was a usual, and he stepped up onto the platform next to Harry and looked at him with grey eyes that were doing a rapid, practiced assessment. Hogwarts too? The boy said. Yes, Harry said. First year? Yes. The grey eyes had settled on the scar. They didn't linger the way most people's did, didn't go wide or fill with that particular complicated reverence. They noted it, catalogued it, and moved on, which was actually more interesting. I'm Draco, the boy said. Draco Malfoy. Harry Potter. Not a flicker. Or rather, a flicker so controlled it was almost invisible, but Harry caught it, the very slight adjustment in the set of the boy's jaw that meant he'd already known and had been deciding whether to pretend he hadn't. I know, Draco said, and then, with the tone of someone choosing their words with the same care you'd choose a fencing position, the Prophet article this morning. That was you. The events in the article were me. The article itself was Skeeter. Something in Draco's expression shifted, almost, not quite, into a smile. You read carefully. Most things are worth reading carefully. Behind Draco, one of the adults had gone very still. Harry didn't look directly at him yet, let the measuring tape do its work around his arms and shoulders, kept his attention apparently on the middle distance while cataloguing everything in his peripheral vision. The man was tall, blond like the boy, with long hair and a walking stick that was either an affectation or a wand holster or both. His robes were expensive. His stillness was the kind that comes from discipline rather than comfort, the stillness of a predator, not a statue. The woman next to him, Draco's mother, clearly, same bone structure, had her eyes on Harry with an expression that was measuring in a different way. Not hostile. More like someone reading a map and recalculating a route. Harry looked at Draco. "You should come sit with me on the train," he said, which was not what either of them had expected him to say. September 1st. I want to know what students from old families are told about how the ministry works. Or doesn't work, more accurately. Draco blinked. It was subtle, but real. You want information. I want perspective. Those are different things. Information I can get from documents. Perspective requires a person. A beat. Draco was working something out. Harry could see it, the mental arithmetic of what this meant, what was being offered, what might be owed. He was 10 years old and already thinking 3 moves ahead, which Harry found genuinely interesting. My father, Draco said carefully, might have opinions about the things you've done. I expect quite a lot of people will, Harry said pleasantly. That's not really my problem. Something that might, in better lighting and with more certainty, have been amusement crossed Draco's face. The man with the walking stick stepped forward. He did it smoothly, elegantly, in the way of someone who knew how to make movement into a statement. He placed himself just to the left of his son, not in front, not protective, more like punctuation. Mr. Potter, Lucius Malfoy said. His voice was the kind of voice that had been trained, not born, refined over years into something that could deliver almost any content while sounding like the most reasonable thing anyone had ever said. I believe I've heard a great deal about you this morning. Most people have, Harry said. I wondered, Lucius continued, with the particular tone of a man unwrapping a gift he already knew the contents of, whether a boy of your evident intelligence had considered the long-term implications of restructuring institutions as complex as ministry departments. He paused. Change introduced rapidly, without adequate cultural preparation, can produce instability. And instability, in a society like ours, tends to harm the people at the bottom first. It was a good argument. It was the kind of argument that sounded like concern and functioned as a warning, and Harry took a moment to properly respect it before he replied. You're describing the same logic the ministry used to justify not reforming the financial oversight structures for 20 years, Harry said. Which is how you end up with 8 years of illegal drawdowns going unnoticed. Instability from reform is a real risk. Instability from accumulated unchallenged corruption is also a real risk. The question is which one you choose to manage. He met Lucius Malfoy's eyes, which were pale and grey and considerably more careful than they'd been 15 seconds ago. I've chosen to manage the one I can actually see. The room was very quiet. Madame Malkin's measuring tape had stopped moving. Indeed, Lucius said, after a moment that had a particular texture to it, not concession, not retreat, but the quiet of a very good chess player recognizing that they're in a game worth taking seriously. He smiled, and it reached most of his face but stopped somewhere short of his eyes. I do hope Hogwarts agrees with you, Mr. Potter. The school has a great deal to offer a boy with the right connections. I'm sure it does, Harry said. Draco. September 1st. He didn't phrase it as a question the second time either. He stepped off the measuring platform, collected his robe order ticket, and left. On the street, in the morning sunshine, he allowed himself approximately 3 seconds to feel how fast his heart was going, and then he evened his breathing and moved on. Lucius Malfoy was not Fudge. That much was obvious. He was sharper, more patient, and considerably more dangerous, not because he had power, though he clearly did, but because he had the particular quality of someone who thought ideology and self-interest were the same thing, who'd spent so long believing one that he'd forgotten the other was there. That made him committed. Committed people were harder to dislodge than merely corrupt ones. Harry bought his wand at Ollivander's. Ollivander's was a different kind of strange to everything else he'd experienced in the magical world. The shop was narrow and dusty and covered in boxes in a way that suggested either the boxes were load-bearing or whoever ran the place had simply stopped caring about navigation. The man who appeared from the back was pale and large-eyed and had the quality of old light, still bright, but from a source you couldn't quite locate. Mr. Potter, Ollivander said, and his voice had that same quality, ancient without being decrepit, precise in the way of something that had been refined past its obvious purpose into something else entirely. "I wondered when you'd come." "You know who I am," Harry said. "I know everyone who comes through that door," Ollivander said, not as a boast but as a simple fact. "I know their wands, which means I know something of them. Your mother, 11 inches, willow, swishy, wonderful for charms. Your father, mahogany, 11 inches, pliable, excellent for transfiguration." He was already moving through the boxes, pulling and replacing with the efficiency of a man who knew a map nobody else could read. "And the wand that gave you that scar. 13.5 inches. You. Powerful. And the core, phoenix feather," Harry said. He'd read about this. He knew where this was going. Ollivander looked at him over his shoulder. "You've done your reading." "The feather in my wand," Harry said, "will be from the same bird as the feather in that wand." "Is that correct?" A long pause. "It is." "Does it matter?" Ollivander set down the box he was holding and turned to face him properly, with the full attention of someone who wasn't used to being asked questions he needed to consider. "That depends entirely on what you believe wands are," he said carefully. "If you believe they're tools, then a shared core is a technical complication, a resonance factor that might affect certain spells. If you believe they're something more than tools, I think they're tools with opinions," Harry said. "Which makes them complicated tools, but still tools." Ollivander looked at him for a long moment. Then he made a sound that was absolutely a laugh, swiftly contained. 11 inches, he said, reaching for a different box. "Holly. Let's see about the core." It took 40 minutes. One said no in various ways, a subtle wrongness, a faint resistance, nothing dramatic. Harry ran through them methodically, following Ollivander's directions, and was not particularly surprised when the holly and phoenix feather wand was the one that said yes. A warmth running up his arm, golden sparks, the very faint but definite sensation of something recognizing something. "Curious," Ollivander said, softly. "You say that like it's new information." "It isn't," Ollivander admitted. "But there's something in how you hold it. Most children hold their first wand like a gift. You're holding it like," he tilted his head. "Like a responsibility." Harry looked down at the wand. 11 inches. Holly. The warmth of it had settled into something steady, reliable, like a handshake from someone you instinctively trust. 7 galleons, Ollivander said. Harry paid and left. At the door he paused. "The wands you make," he said, without turning. "Do you keep records of what cores come from where?" "I keep records of everything, Mr. Potter. Including whether there are other wands with feathers from the same bird as mine and, the other one." A silence. "Why do you ask?" "Because if there are, they'll have the same resonance complications. And it's useful to know who's carrying something that complicated before you meet them." Ollivander said nothing for a moment. Then, "Come back when you're older, Mr. Potter. I think that conversation will be worth having." Harry nodded and stepped into the street. He found the Weasleys at the cauldron shop. This was not a planned encounter. He needed a cauldron, pewter, standard size too, per the school list, and the shop was large enough that he was browsing the regulation-compliant options when he heard an argument happening 2 aisles over. Not a heated argument, more the kind of established, low-temperature family disagreement that had been running for so long everyone involved had their parts memorized. "The gold-trimmed one is better, Mum, look, it's got self-stir, we need what's on the list, Fred, not what's got sparkly bits, it's got functional bits, George and I have been telling you, you're not even in the same year as the list, that's never stopped us being helpful." Harry turned the corner and found a family. There was no other word for it, they arrived at you as a unit, red-haired and freckled and occupying space with the comfortable assurance of people who were used to taking up a lot of it. The mother was small and capable looking with the kind of face that could go from warmth to absolute authority in about a third of a second. 2 of the boys, twins, clearly, were gesturing at a cauldron with the enthusiasm of salesmen who'd already sold themselves. A younger boy, about Harry's age, was reading the standard cauldron specifications with his brow furrowed and an expression that suggested the specifications were not living up to expectations. A girl, younger still, was sitting on a pile of cauldron boxes reading something that didn't appear to be related to cauldron selection in any way. The mother looked up from the twins and saw Harry. Her expression did the thing his had been doing to people all morning, the rapid recognition, the recalibration. But unlike most people she recovered quickly, and when she did, the warmth that replaced the surprise seemed entirely genuine. "You're Harry Potter," she said, not accusatorially but in the tone of someone identifying something and deciding immediately what to do about it. "Yes," he said. "Sorry, I didn't mean to, I'm just after a standard cauldron." "Pewter, size 2, the red-haired boy Harry's age said, without looking up from the specifications. "Third rack. They're all the same, the self-stir ones aren't ministry approved for first years and the twins know that. We're making a broader point about institutional conservatism in school supply regulation," one of the twins said with great dignity. "We're really not," the other twin agreed, but it sounded good. "Molly Weasley," the mother said, holding out her hand to Harry. "These are my children, Fred and George, who you've already heard." Ron, the boy with the specifications, looked up and went slightly red, and Ginny. The girl on the cauldron boxes waved without looking up from her book. "Arthur's getting the owl supplies. We're at Hogwarts ourselves, most of us." "All but Ginny," Ron said, and seemed to be working very hard at being normal, which Harry recognized as the particular effort of someone who decided not to make a thing of something and was not quite succeeding. "She's not old enough yet. I'm first year." "Me too," Harry said. Ron nodded. Looked at his specifications again. Then apparently decided that the specifications were not worth more attention than the actual situation and put them down. "The Prophet article," he said. "This morning. Was any of that true?" "Most of it," Harry said. "The part about 17 departments was wrong, there are 17 total, I have interests in 12, not all of them." "But you did purchase controlling interests in," Harry said, not correcting to be pedantic but because the distinction mattered. "Right." Ron considered this. Why? Nobody else had asked why. They'd asked how, and what does it mean, and several variations of "are you quite sure about this," but not why, and Harry found the directness of it unexpectedly refreshing. "Because they were already bought," Harry said. "My ancestors bought them centuries ago, through legal agreements that never expired. The ministry just forgot about them, or hoped nobody else would remember." "I remembered." "So you didn't spend loads of money just to be in charge of things?" "No. Though I did make some additional purchases yesterday from liquid vault funds. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement, mainly." Ron's eyes were the Weasley blue, bright and direct. "Because of the Aurors?" "Partly. Because of Sirius Black." Harry looked at him. Ron had clearly read the full article, carefully. "You know about Black?" "Dad works at the ministry," Ron said, without any particular drama. "He talks about things at dinner when he doesn't know we're listening, which is most of the time. The Black case it's one of those things. It bothers him. Because Black didn't get a trial?" "Because Dad thinks the whole war period bothers people," Ron said, and there was something in his tone that was older than 10, the particular weight of having grown up with something complicated in your background radiation. "He doesn't say it in so many words. But it bothers him." They ended up leaving the shop together, which hadn't been planned but felt inevitable, in the way that some things do. Molly Weasley had produced the self-stir cauldron compromise option that was technically approved for third year and above, which mollified the twins, and the family moved through Diagon Alley with Harry absorbed into their orbit in a natural, unremarkable way that he found surprisingly comfortable. Fred and George explained to him, unprompted but with great enthusiasm, that they had been running a small-scale joke product enterprise from their dormitory for 2 years, which they presented with the pride of genuine entrepreneurs. They were also, Harry noted, considerably sharper than their performance of chaos suggested. They noticed everything, processed it quickly, and filed it with the easy confidence of people who'd learned that being underestimated was an asset. The Ministry article, Fred said, as they walked. The bit about the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, we have a professional interest, George continued. In the departmental mandate to regulate and approve magical products for consumer use, Fred finished, with a tone that had moved from casual to very precise indeed. You want to know if the purchasing structure changes the approval process, Harry said. We want to know if the approval process might become, George said, more focused on actual safety outcomes, and less focused on suppressing commercial competition from small producers, Fred added. Harry looked at both of them. They looked back. Write it up, he said. What you're producing, what the current approval issues are, what a better process would look like. Specific and honest, not persuasive. Just accurate. Send it to the Joint Governance Board at Gringotts when it's set up, sharp blade, attention junior correspondence clerk. They'll route it to the right person. A beat. You're serious, George said. I'm Harry. Fred laughed out loud. George looked at Harry with something that hadn't been in his expression before, not just the usual complicated reaction, but something more specific. Respect, the particular kind that has to be earned. Arthur Weasley found them outside the apothecary. He was a tall, thin man with the pleased, slightly distracted look of someone who spent a lot of time finding things interesting. When he saw Harry he went through the recognition process faster than most adults did, and arrived at a response that was neither fawning nor guarded but simply warm. Well, Arthur said, to no one in particular and everyone in general. The week does keep getting more interesting. Dad, Ron said, with the tone of a person who'd said Dad in exactly that way many times before. I'm just observing, Arthur said mildly. He looked at Harry with those bright, interested Weasley eyes. The audit findings. I imagine several of my colleagues are having rather fraught mornings. I didn't release the audit to cause alarm, Harry said. I released it because the information existed and belonged in front of the right oversight structures. The right oversight structures, Arthur said, tasting the phrase. Which now, in 12 departments, partially involve you. Partially. Gringotts is the actual auditing authority. I'm just the stakeholder who finally showed up. Arthur Weasley looked at him for a long moment, with an expression that Harry found impossible to read entirely, something thoughtful and careful and complicated, in the way that things are complicated when you work inside a system that needs changing and have spent years deciding what to do about that. I work in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office, Arthur said. Which is, not one of your 12 departments. The Muggle Liaison Office and the Misuse Division, Harry said. I know. They're under General Ministry authority. I didn't purchase them. Intentionally. They're the departments that need the most cultural work rather than structural work, Harry said honestly. Changing the oversight won't fix what's wrong with them. I'd rather leave them operating and find a different approach. Arthur looked at him for another moment. Then he said, with quiet precision, you should come to dinner sometime, Harry. Molly does a roast on Fridays. I think you'd find it more interesting than eating alone. Harry looked at the family around him, the twins now arguing about something else entirely, Ginny back to her book on a nearby bench, Ron standing slightly to his right with the careful posture of someone hoping for a particular outcome without letting on that they're hoping. I'd like that, Harry said. It was true when he said it. That surprised him slightly. He was nearly back to the leaky cauldron, arms full of packages, when the photographer caught up with him. She was young, mid-20s, with quick eyes and a camera that floated independently at about shoulder height as though it had its own agenda. She wasn't the aggressive kind, didn't shove the camera at him or shout, just fell into step beside him with the professional ease of someone who'd learned that ambush was less productive than companionship. 5 minutes, she said. Off the record if you want. Lavinia Blight, the prophet. Skeeter's photographer. Harry said. Skeeter's former photographer, Lavinia said, with the particular emphasis of someone who has recently made a decision they feel good about. As of this morning. I had some concerns about the article. What kind of concerns? Factual ones. She looked at him sideways. The paragraph 14 facts were right. Everything around them wasn't. And I took the photographs that accompanied the piece, which means my name is attached to it. Harry stopped walking. Turned to look at her. The camera bobbed politely at shoulder height. What do you want to do about it? He asked. I want to do a correction piece. Accurate, documented, specific. She met his eyes. I wanted to say what you actually did and why it matters, without making it sound like a coup or a tantrum or whatever Skeeter decided the framing was. And I want your comment on the record. One condition, Harry said. Go ahead. You send me the draft before publication. Not to approve it, to fact-check it. Anything that's wrong, I'll mark it wrong and tell you why. Anything that's right, you can quote me saying it's accurate. Lavinia considered this. That's not how journalism usually. Skeeter's approach is how journalism usually works at the Prophet, Harry said. I'm not asking to control the story. I'm asking to be informed if it's going to contain inaccuracies about me. You can print whatever you decide to print. But at least you'll know what's true. A pause. The camera floated slightly left. Deal, Lavinia said. She held out her hand. Wizard's oath or just a handshake? Handshake's fine, Harry said. I believe people until they give me a reason not to. She shook his hand and walked away efficiently. The camera went with her, still at shoulder height, already aimed somewhere more interesting. The letter from Dumbledore arrived that evening. Harry was sitting on his bed in the leaky cauldron room Tom had found for him, clean, quiet, window overlooking the back courtyard, with his new books spread around him and a cup of tea going cold on the bedside table. The owl was large and rather magnificent, the kind of bird that had been specifically selected for the impression it would make, which told him something already. The letter was written in purple ink, the handwriting looping and elaborate, and the tone was precisely what Harry had expected, warm, slightly avuncular, with a layer of careful intent running under the warmth like wire under cloth. Dear Harry, I trust you are settling into the wizarding world with the energy and intelligence I have always known you to possess. News of your recent activities has reached me, as I suspect you anticipated it would, and I write to say, simply, that I look forward to meeting you properly in September. I should tell you, because I believe honesty is almost always the best policy, that I was aware of your family's estates and their legal structures. I made certain choices, during the period following your parents' deaths, that prioritized your safety and well-being over certain other considerations. I hope, in time, you will allow me to explain those choices fully, and to address any concerns you may have. I am aware that there are likely to be several. Hogwarts is a remarkable place, Harry. I hope it will become a home to you. With warmest regards, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Harry read it twice. The second time more slowly, paying attention to what wasn't there. No apology. Not yet, framed as hope, in time, you will allow me to explain, which kept the explanation itself in Dumbledore's possession rather than offering it. Certain choices rather than specifics. Safety and well-being over certain other considerations rather than naming the considerations. He was good. Harry respected it, in the precise way you can respect skill in someone you're also being appropriately careful of. He wrote back. Kept it short. Dear Professor Dumbledore, thank you for writing. I do look forward to September as well. I agree that honesty is almost always the best policy, and I'll admit I find the almost in that sentence interesting. I'll save my questions for when we can discuss them properly. There are quite a few. Regards, Harry Potter. He sent it with Tom's house owl, which was smaller and considerably less magnificent than Dumbledore's but got the job done. Then he organized his books by subject, made a list of the things he still needed to understand about magical contract law, and went to sleep. Outside, Diagon Alley quieted from a roar to a murmur to something like peace. The magical world was doing what it would spend the next several months doing, adjusting. Recalibrating. Working out where this new thing fit in the map they'd all been using, or whether the map itself needed redrawing. In his office on the 4th floor of the Ministry of Magic, Cornelius Fudge sat behind his desk and reread the documents he'd signed that morning. A bottle of something amber sat at his elbow. He hadn't opened it yet, but he was thinking about it. In Wiltshire, in a drawing room where the walls held portraits of people with the same pale eyes and patient expressions, Lucius Malfoy sat in a high-backed chair and wrote a letter to 3 different people simultaneously, each one different, each one precise, all of them circling the same point. 10 years old, he wrote, in the 3rd letter, to the one person who he thought most needed to understand. A 10-year-old child, and already he thinks about the Department of Magical Law Enforcement first. Consider what he'll do with a wand and 5 years of education. We should decide now how to handle this. Before September. And in his room in the Leaky Cauldron, Harry Potter slept, dreamless and unafraid, while the world arranged itself in new patterns around the fact of him. Chapter 3, The Express to Somewhere Complicated. September 1st arrived the way important days usually do, with the quality of ordinary morning light that doesn't know it's supposed to feel significant. Harry was at King's Cross by 10, which gave him 50 minutes before the train left and enough time to find the barrier without rushing. He'd read about Platform 9 3/4 in the same library book that had told him about the Leaky Cauldron, and when he found the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 he walked through it with his trolley at a steady pace, not running, not hesitating, the same way he'd walked into every room that summer that he wasn't sure about. The Hogwarts Express was extraordinary. He stood on the platform and gave himself the same 3 seconds he'd given Diagon Alley, let the steam and the noise and the particular crimson magnificence of the train sit on his eyes properly, and then he loaded his trunk and found a compartment and settled in with a book. The compartment filled up gradually around him. First a pair of girls who looked at the seat across from his and then at him and then at each other and chose a different compartment without explanation. Then 2 boys who clearly didn't know each other either, sat at opposite ends of the compartment, and began a competition to see who could look most like they were minding their own business. Then Ron Weasley, who arrived the way Ron always seemed to arrive at things, with momentum that slightly outpaced his plan, and spotted Harry through the compartment window and opened the door. "Right," Ron said. "Can I?" "Yes," Harry said. "Close the door." Ron dropped into the seat across from him with a relief he was working to conceal and did a reasonable job. He was dressed in slightly too short robes that had clearly been let down at the hem more than once, and he had a smudge of something on his left hand that looked like it had been there since breakfast. He put his bag on the seat next to him and looked at Harry with those direct blue eyes. "My mum packed sandwiches," he said. "She packed about twice as many as I can eat. You want some?" "Yes please," Harry said, which seemed to surprise Ron slightly, as though he'd expected a polite refusal. Harry put his book down. "Turkey. Cheese and pickle. And some ham ones." Ron started unpacking them with the efficiency of someone very familiar with the contents of their own lunch bag. "The twins are in the back of the train doing something they swore me to secrecy about, so don't ask." "I won't." Harry took a sandwich. Ginny was upset, on the platform. Ron glanced up. "You saw that? Hard to miss." Ron was quiet for a moment, pulling the crust off one of the sandwiches with the automatic habit of someone who didn't know they were doing it. "She's been wanting to come to Hogwarts since she could talk," he said. "It's another year for her. She'll be fine." "I know she will," Harry said. "I just noticed." Ron looked at him, and something in his expression settled, the wariness that most people carried around Harry, the sense of having to manage the encounter, just eased. Like a knot releasing. He ate his sandwich. Harry ate his. The train had started moving, London sliding past the windows, the platform shrinking into distance. The 2 boys at the ends of the compartment, Harry had already mentally labeled them as Neville and an unnamed anxious kid, were beginning to relax too, now that nobody was asking them anything. Neville, Harry said, addressing the rounder-faced of the two. The boy startled. What's your family name? Longbottom, Neville said, as if bracing for something. Your grandmother raised you, Harry said. It wasn't a question, he'd read enough about the prominent magical families through his summer studying to know the name Longbottom, and the particular shape of that story. Neville went very still. Yes. She's a formidable woman by all accounts. Harry said it matter-of-factly, not gently, not with the particular careful softness people used when they were being considerate about something painful. Just factually, because it was a fact. You've got a lot to live up to but also a lot to live from. That's not a bad position. Neville stared at him for a moment. Then he said, quietly, most people just say they're sorry. For your parents, Harry said. I know. I'm sorry about that part too. But I don't think you need more people being sorry about the parts you can't change. A silence. Neville nodded, just once, and the set of his shoulders was different after. The door slid open. Hermione Granger came in with 3 books under one arm and a cat carrier in the other hand, from which a large ginger cat was emitting sounds of profound bureaucratic complaint. She was dressed in her new school robes with the precise tidiness of someone who had ironed them that morning and was fairly sure everyone else hadn't, and she took in the compartment in one sweeping glance. Harry, she said. Hermione. He moved his bag. There's room. Also there are sandwiches. I've eaten, she said, sitting down and settling the cat carrier at her feet. The cat, apparently satisfied that someone was now within complaining range, went slightly quieter. Crookshanks, Hermione added, for the compartment's benefit. He's half Kneazle. He didn't approve of the journey. Most people don't, Ron said, and then looked faintly surprised that he'd said it. Hermione looked at him with the assessing directness she brought to everything. Ron Weasley, she said. Your father works in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office. Your mother went to Hogwarts in the 60s. You have 5 siblings, all at or previously at Hogwarts, and, based on the robes, you've inherited at least 2 of their school things. Ron went slightly red. Is this your way of introducing yourself? I read about most of the old wizarding families over the summer, Hermione said, without the slightest apology. It seemed useful. I'm Muggle-born, so I didn't come in already knowing all of this. I had to find it out deliberately. She paused. The robes aren't a flaw. They're efficient. Ron looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. They're also too short, he said, but thank you for trying. Something that might become friendship was beginning at the seams, Harry thought. Not fully formed, still uncertain, still slightly too formal, but there. The raw material of it. Draco Malfoy arrived an hour into the journey, which Harry had expected. He came with 2 large boys he introduced as Crabbe and Goyle, who occupied space with the dedicated purposefulness of people whose main professional skill was occupying space, and whose eyes moved slowly between Draco and Harry with the slightly delayed tracking of people waiting to be told how to feel about something. Potter, Draco said. Draco, Harry said. Sit down. Crabbe and Goyle can have the corridor, there's not enough room. Draco looked at him. Then he said, with a small gesture of his head, wait outside, to Crabbe and Goyle, who went without complaint. He sat across from Harry, next to Ron, which produced a very specific silence from both of them, the silence of 2 people who know of each other primarily through reputation and are now deciding which version of that reputation to act on. Draco's eyes moved across the compartment, cataloguing Ron's robes, Hermione's books, Neville's general anxiety, the cat carrier. Settling back on Harry. You wanted perspective, Draco said. I did, Harry agreed. Tell me what your father said about what I did in Diagon Alley. Draco's chin lifted very slightly. He said you were impulsive. What did you think? A pause. It was a real one, not performed. Draco was actually considering his answer. I thought you weren't impulsive at all, he said carefully. I thought you'd been planning it or something like it for a while. And I thought my father knew that too, and called it impulsive for a different reason. What reason? Because impulsive is manageable, Draco said. Impulsive things run out of energy. Impulsive people can be waited out. Harry looked at him steadily. And you didn't look like someone who runs out of energy. Draco said it with the particular tone of someone giving away more than they'd planned to and knowing it. He glanced at Hermione, who was watching the conversation with the focused attention of someone taking detailed mental notes. Granger, he said, which made Hermione's eyes sharpen. You already know who I am. Draco Malfoy, she said. Your family has a specific position on Muggle-born witches and wizards. My family has a specific position on most things, Draco said, which was not a denial and both of them knew it. What I think is a different matter. Is it? Hermione asked, and the question had no edge. She was genuinely asking, which seemed to catch Draco slightly off balance. I grew up in a house where certain ideas are the water, Draco said, after a moment. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I'm also sitting in this compartment. He looked at Harry. Which I chose to do. Fair point, Harry said. Ron was eating another sandwich with the focused attention of someone who had decided to let other people do the complicated social work. But Harry noticed he was following every word. What did your father say after impulsive? Harry asked Draco. Draco straightened slightly. He said you were dangerous specifically because you understood legal frameworks better than most adults. He said the purchasing agreements you used were technically valid but politically explosive, and that you deployed them in a sequence that, he used the word elegant. Draco said the word like he was handling something that might be alive. My father doesn't use that word lightly. What else? He wrote letters. Several. He wouldn't tell me to who. Draco looked at the window for a moment. He's planning something. I don't know what. But when he gets that particular expression, very calm, very patient, something is being arranged. It was, Harry reflected, a very significant piece of information to offer voluntarily. He looked at Draco. Draco looked back, and something was being negotiated in that exchange that neither of them would have been able to fully articulate but both of them understood precisely. Why are you telling me? Harry said. Draco's jaw moved once. Because I want to make choices that aren't just, I want to decide what I think rather than inherit it. He said it stiffly, like the words had cost something. And I think I should start doing that now, before Hogwarts makes the decision for me. Harry nodded. All right. All right, Draco repeated, as if trying the word out, finding it fit. You should know, Harry said, that this compartment is not a political position. I'm not asking you to agree with me about everything or to be visibly allied with me or to do anything that puts you in a difficult position with your family unnecessarily. Draco blinked. You're not. No. I'm just, talking to you. Because you're interesting and you showed up when you said you would. Harry shrugged slightly. Everything else is your business. Something shifted in Draco Malfoy's face, very briefly, before the controlled mask reasserted itself. It looked, just for a second, like relief. The witch with the trolley came, and Harry bought enough for the whole compartment without announcement, just handed things around, and when Ron started to protest Harry said, I have more money than I know what to do with and you have better sandwiches, so we're even, which Ron seemed to find both offensive and acceptable in roughly equal measure. Neville had a chocolate frog that he shared unprompted, and the card inside was Dumbledore, which Harry pocketed because the biography on the back was interesting and slightly incomplete in ways he was already noting. Draco left after an hour, taking his shadow-like bodyguards with him, but the leaving was different to an exit. He said he'd see them at the castle with the flat confidence of someone stating a fact, and Harry said yes without inflection, and Ron watched the compartment door close and then said, very carefully, he's not what I expected. No, Harry agreed. Is he trustworthy? Harry considered the question properly. He wants to be something that isn't just what his father made him. That's real. Whether it's enough to make him trustworthy in a crisis, I don't know yet. We'll see. Ron absorbed this. Your diplomatic skills, he said, are a bit alarming. I grew up in a house where saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment had consequences, Harry said, lightly, and the lightness was deliberate, a way of saying and closing the topic simultaneously. Ron heard both parts. Hermione had been reading during the last portion of this, or appearing to read, which Harry was already learning were different things where she was concerned. She looked up now. The Ministry audit results, she said. When are they due to be released publicly? The first summary goes to the Gringotts Financial Oversight Committee on the 15th, Harry said. Full public release probably takes another 2 weeks after that. What's in the summary that people aren't going to like? Several departments maintained budget lines for programs that stopped running in 1986, Harry said. The money didn't stop moving. It just stopped going to the programs. Someone will need to account for where it went instead. Hermione set her book face down on her knee. That's going to be destabilizing. Yes. You knew that when you started this. Yes. She looked at him with those sharp brown eyes. Does that not worry you? It worries me more to leave it running, Harry said. A system that steals from people while telling them it's protecting them doesn't stop on its own. It gets more comfortable. He met her eyes. It worried me that it wasn't worrying anyone else. Neville had been listening throughout all of this with the increasingly alert expression of someone who had come to Hogwarts expecting one sort of year and was now fairly confident they were in for quite another sort. My Gran, he said, haltingly. She always said the Ministry was, that it had problems. She said it in a way that suggested you weren't supposed to do anything about the problems, just, know about them and be disappointed. That's a very efficient way to maintain a broken system, Hermione said, with the particular crispness of someone whose outsider perspective has given them an unobstructed view of something insiders can't see anymore. Neville looked at her. Yes, he said. That's exactly it. Outside, the landscape had changed from suburb to countryside, rolling green hills and cloud-stacked sky, and the compartment had settled into something that felt, unexpectedly, like the beginning of something rather than the journey toward it. They arrived at Hogsmeade Station as the sky was going dark, and the transition from train to boats to castle happened with the organized chaos of a process that had been running for centuries and knew its own rhythms. Harry sat in a boat with Ron, Hermione, and Neville, and when the castle came into view around the cliff edge he did what he'd done at every important threshold this summer, gave it 3 seconds, properly, let it be as extraordinary as it was. It was extraordinary. The kind of extraordinary that suggested the building itself had opinions about the people coming to live in it, which Harry was fairly sure was literally true. Professor McGonagall met them in the entrance hall. She was exactly what she looked like, a woman of absolute precision, iron competence, and a warmth so well disciplined it only showed at the corners of her mouth and the edges of her eyes when something genuinely pleased her. She looked at the assembled first years with the experienced eye of someone who'd been doing this long enough to see patterns in people. When her eye reached Harry, it paused. Just briefly. Then moved on with the professional control of someone who'd decided to treat everything equally until she had reason not to. Welcome to Hogwarts, she said. The sorting will begin shortly. Before you enter the Great Hall, I'll explain the process. The sorting hat, said a girl near the back. It sings a song and then puts you in a house. McGonagall looked at her. 5 points to whichever house you're sorted into, for doing the reading, she said drily. For everyone else, Miss Hermione Granger. Miss Granger is correct. The hat will consider your qualities and make its determination. This is not a test. You cannot fail. She paused on that word just long enough to acknowledge that she'd said it, and that for this particular group of 11-year-olds, not failing was not actually the bar any of them were most concerned about. The Great Hall was everything Harry had read that it would be, and also several things that could only be understood by being inside it. The ceiling was the sky, genuinely or very convincingly, and the candlelight and the 4 long tables and the several hundred older students already seated and watching the incoming first years with a mixture of amusement and calculation created a particular atmosphere, specific, unrepeatable, Hogwarts. The Hat's psalm was interesting. It talked about the houses in the standard terms: courage, ambition, wisdom, loyalty, but there were lines in it that Harry caught and filed, references to unity that sounded less like celebration and more like memory, like the Hat was singing about something that had been lost rather than something that existed. Then the sorting began. He watched it with genuine interest, watching people's faces as the Hat called out its decisions, watching the table responses, the particular quality of Gryffindor's noise versus Slytherin's more restrained acknowledgement, Ravenclaw's thoughtful reception, Hufflepuff's warmth. Hermione went to Gryffindor and sat down with the pleased, slightly overwhelmed expression of someone arriving at a place they'd wanted to be for a long time. Neville went to Gryffindor and looked surprised, as though he'd been expecting something else and was still deciding how to feel about not getting it. Draco went to Slytherin, which surprised nobody, but Harry noticed the set of his jaw as he walked to the table, not proud, exactly, or not only that. Complicated. Then, Potter, Harry. The hall went quiet in the specific way of a large space when a significant number of people all make the same decision at the same moment. Harry walked to the stool with the easy stride that he'd practiced all summer without quite knowing he was practicing it, not performing confidence, just not performing the absence of it either. The hat dropped over his eyes and the hall disappeared. "Well," said a voice, directly into his skull, sounding old and amused and considerably more awake than something made of fabric had any right to be. "Here you are." "Here I am," Harry agreed. "You're very calm for someone who's been rewriting the government." "I didn't rewrite it. I adjusted the ownership structure of some departments." "That's a very tidy way of putting it." The hat sounded, if such a thing were possible, delighted. "You are extraordinary, Mr. Potter. I've been doing this for 1,000 years and I've sorted extraordinary students before, some of them quite famous, but the particular combination of what you have here," he could feel it, something warm and rummaging in the back of his mind, gentle but thorough. "The courage is obvious. Most students who have it don't know what to do with it yet. You've been using yours since you were 10 years old, functionally." "I've been using it since I was younger than that," Harry said. "It just wasn't about the ministry." The hat went quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of not knowing, the quiet of understanding something that didn't need elaboration. "The intelligence is also obvious," the hat continued. "And the ambition, you do have it, though it's not the kind that wants things for their own sake. It's the kind that wants things because it has a specific vision of how they should be." A pause. "That's actually rarer." "So what does that make me?" Harry asked. "It makes you someone I need to think about carefully," the hat said. "You would excel in any house I could put you in. Ravenclaw would sharpen your mind. Hufflepuff would ground your sense of justice in something warmer than strategy. Slytherin would give you access to networks you'll need to navigate eventually." Another pause. "But you know where you want to go." "Do I?" "You've known since the moment you walked in," the hat said, with the certain tone of something that has made 1,000 years of being wrong seem impossible. "Not because of the house's reputation. Because of the specific qualities it represents to you. And because of where the people you've already chosen to stand near are going to be sitting." Harry thought about Ron eating sandwiches and Hermione with her books and Neville's shoulders dropping when someone talked to him like he wasn't about to fail. "Connection matters more than I expected it to," Harry said quietly, and he wasn't sure if he was talking to the hat or to himself. "That," the hat said, with something that was unmistakably warmth, "is the most Gryffindor thing anyone has said to me in 40 years. Then, out loud, to the hall, "Gryffindor." The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry took the hat off, handed it back to McGonagall, and walked to the table with the same easy stride, sat down between Hermione and Ron, and reached for the nearest bread roll because he hadn't eaten since the train sandwiches and he was genuinely hungry. Well? Ron said. Well, what? What was it like? Inside the hat. Like a very well-read person asking pointed questions, Harry said. The bread's good. Dumbledore's welcome feast speech was warm and slightly whimsical and contained several things that Harry suspected were both completely sincere and also precisely calibrated for effect, which he found interesting about the man even before they'd had a proper conversation. He watched the headmaster during the speech the way he'd watched Lucius at Madame Malkin's, not staring, just attentive, gathering. Dumbledore was a large presence even sitting still. Not physically large, though he was tall, large the way that certain rooms are large because they've held important things for a long time. His eyes moved across the student body with genuine affection that wasn't just performance, and when they reached Harry they lingered for a moment with something that was not quite the general complicated reaction Harry had learned to recognize all summer. This was more specific. More personal. He'd known Harry's parents. Harry had known that intellectually. He felt it now, for the first time, looking at the face of someone who carried that knowledge, and it produced something in his chest that was unexpected and that he identified, after a moment, as grief, adjacent but specific, the grief of having something explained to you from a distance when you'd have preferred to know it firsthand. He let himself feel it for a moment. Then he ate his dinner. After dinner, after the first years were herded upstairs and given the password and shown the common room, after the dormitory introductions and the unpacking of trunks and the general negotiation of a new shared space, Harry sat on his bed with the curtains half drawn and thought. The common room below was quieting. Ron's snores had started, the boy could sleep with impressive speed, like switching off a light. Neville had fallen asleep clutching his Remembrall, which was glowing faintly red, which Harry made a mental note to investigate later. He thought about Dumbledore's letter. The almost in honesty is almost always the best policy. He thought about the full 10 years of his childhood in the Dursleys' cupboard, the very specific form that being hidden from the world had taken. He thought about 20 rings sitting in cases in vaults at Gringotts, unclaimed for a decade, accumulating dust and interest and a large pile of departmental theft. He didn't feel angry about it, exactly. Anger was imprecise. He felt the need for answers, sharp and specific, and the understanding that Dumbledore was going to give him those answers on Dumbledore's timeline unless Harry made the question itself unavoidable. He knew how to make questions unavoidable. It was the same principle as the ministry documents, you didn't ask people to hand you the thing they were holding. You made the legal framework around the thing clear enough that handing it over became easier than not. He'd have to think about how that applied to a conversation. He was still thinking about it when sleep arrived, quiet and certain, and took him. The morning was chaos of the productive variety, schedules distributed, staircases navigated with varying degrees of success, the great hall at breakfast loud and energetic in the way of large numbers of people all trying to sort out where they were supposed to be. Professor Snape's potions class was at 10. Harry had read about Snape over the summer, not in depth, but enough. The name appeared in several places in the documents he'd studied, an Aura record reference, thin and edited, from the war period, and a staff listing in the Hogwarts charter documents, where his name had been in place for 10 years. He taught potions. He'd taught it since Harry was 1 year old. He'd been there before, during, and after everything. The dungeons were cold. The classroom smelled of things that had been boiling and hardening and distilling for a very long time. The Slytherins were already seated on one side, Draco gave Harry a brief, neutral nod, and the Gryffindors filed in on the other. Snape arrived without announcement, simply appeared at the front of the room as though the dungeon had produced him as a natural consequence of the space, and looked at the assembled first years with black eyes that had the quality of something that had been observing and deciding for a long time. "Potter," he said, before he'd taken attendance, before he'd done anything else, just said the name, precisely, like he'd been saving it. "Professor," Harry said. "I've heard a great deal about you this summer." Snape's voice was low and perfectly calibrated, every word arriving with the same weight, which meant you had to pay attention to tell which ones mattered. The ministry audits. The purchasing agreements. The Gringotts documents. A pause that had texture. "Tell me, Mr. Potter. What is a bezoar?" It was a specific choice of opening, not what have you done or who do you think you are, both of which Harry had been preparing for. Instead, a direct technical question, which was a way of establishing authority through knowledge rather than status. Harry respected it. "A bezoar is a stone formed in the stomach of a goat," Harry said. "It's an antidote to most poisons." A beat of silence. "Where would you find a bezoar?" Snape continued, now with the quality of someone who has begun a process and isn't going to stop it partway. "The same place, a goat's stomach. Or a reputable apothecary. They're usually kept in the dried substances section." "What is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "They're the same plant," Harry said. "Also called aconite. Different common names depending on the regional herbology tradition. The Welsh name is different again." Snape looked at him. It was a particular look, not the complicated reverence Harry was used to, not the wariness, not the calculation. Something more specific. Something that didn't quite have a category yet but was in the process of developing one. "You've done your reading, Mr. Potter," he said. "I usually do," Harry said. A very small sound from Hermione, not quite a laugh, compressed into something more socially appropriate. Ron had covered his mouth with his hand. Draco, across the room, was looking at the desk with the careful focus of someone hiding their expression. Snape's gaze moved to Hermione. "Miss Granger. The same questions." He asked them. She answered them correctly, quickly, with the precision of someone who had not only read the answers but understood them. Snape's expression as she finished was, not approval, nothing so simple, but something adjacent to acknowledgement. 10 points to Gryffindor, he said, which surprised the room and seemed to surprise Snape slightly too, as though the decision had been made by some more honest part of him before the rest could intervene. He moved on before anyone could respond. "Open your textbooks. Page 22. We will not be brewing anything today. We will be reading the foundational principles of potion safety, which several of you are going to wish you had memorized before your second class, when I will be testing you on them." Harry opened his book. Under the desk, Ron nudged his knee and gave him a look that communicated about 12 different things at once, most of them variations on that was extraordinary. Harry gave him a look back that communicated eat your breakfast next time and you'll be less distracting. Ron grinned. It was, Harry thought, a very good grin. The kind that made the room slightly warmer. Flying class was Thursday, and the brooms were old and the ground was cold and the Slytherins were on the other side of the pitch, which did not prevent Draco from engineering a confrontation before the instructor had even arrived. It started with Neville's Remembrall, which Madame Hooch had confiscated and then neglected to return, and which somehow ended up in Draco's hand as he circled on his broom 15 feet up with the ease of someone who'd been flying since childhood. "Give it back," Neville said, from the ground, with more courage than anyone expected. His voice shook but he said it. Harry watched Draco's face. Saw something move across it, habit, performance, the particular script of someone doing the expected thing because the situation called for it and the situation was in charge, not them. "Draco," Harry said, from where he was standing beside his broom. He hadn't mounted it yet. His voice was conversational, entirely untroubled. "Give it back to him." Draco looked at him from 15 feet up. The whole class watched. "And if I don't?" Draco said, which was mostly habit again, what you said when challenged. "Then I'll come up there," Harry said, in the same tone. "And I'll take it back. And then this will be a much more interesting flying lesson than Madame Hooch planned, and probably not in a way that ends well for either of us." He held Draco's eyes. "Or you give it back right now, and we get on with things, and this stops being about Neville's Remembrall before it becomes about something else." A moment that stretched. Draco's jaw was doing the thing Harry had seen before at Madame Malkin's, the small internal calculation, the weighing. He was not, at his core, cruel the way some people were cruel, the way Dudley had sometimes been cruel, casually, for its own sake. He was performing something he'd been taught to perform, and he was currently in the process of deciding whether it was worth the effort. He dropped the remembrall. It tumbled downward and Harry stepped forward and caught it without looking, moved instinctively, hand up, the ball snapping into his palm with a clean certainty that surprised even him. The entire class went quiet. Madame Hooch arrived at precisely that moment, took in the scene, and said, "Everyone on your brooms, please," with the diplomatic timing of someone who decided that whatever had just happened, the lesson was the lesson. Harry handed the remembrall back to Neville, who stared at the catch with wide eyes. "You should practice flying," Harry told him. "You'll be good at it once it stops feeling dangerous." "How do you know?" Neville asked. "Because you pick things up faster than you think you do," Harry said. "You just don't know it yet." Neville looked down at his remembrall, which had gone a clear bright pink, which Harry was fairly sure meant something had clicked into place. He filed it away. In the air, on a broomstick, the world was simply different. The wind was real and the height was real and his whole body understood it before his brain had finished processing, hands steady on the handle, weight balanced, the ground falling away below and the sky opening above with that specific generosity that large open things have, the generosity of room. He flew. He didn't show off. He didn't race anyone or execute maneuvers he hadn't been taught. He just flew, clean and direct and at peace in a way he didn't experience often enough to take for granted. The wind at this height smelled different to any wind he'd encountered before, and the castle spread below him was extraordinary from above in an entirely different way than it had been from below. He understood, suddenly and completely, why wizards loved this. "Landing," Hermione said, "you're a natural," with the tone of someone recording an observation rather than giving a compliment. "I think I've been one for a while," Harry said. "I just didn't know it." Ron, beside him, said nothing, just looked at the castle with an expression that was private and specific, the expression of someone who'd grown up with the magical world and sometimes needed reminding why it was extraordinary. That evening, in the common room, Harry wrote 3 letters. One to Sharpblade at Gringotts, a query about the timeline for the Wisengamot Financial Committee meeting, and a follow-up about the Black Case Review status. One to Lavinia Blight, whose draft correction piece had arrived that morning via School Owl and was 90% accurate with 2 significant factual errors he'd marked and returned. The third letter was short. "Dear Professor Dumbledore, I'd like to meet properly, at your convenience. Not the general welcome, I mean a real conversation, in your office or wherever you prefer. I have several questions. I think you know most of them already. It would be more efficient to have them answered than to arrive at them gradually through circumstance. I'm free most afternoons after 4. Regards, Harry Potter." He sealed it and handed it to the school owl that had adopted him somewhere between Hogsmeade and the castle, a barn owl that Ron had immediately named Bureaucrat, which Harry thought was genuinely excellent. He sent the letters. Then he sat by the common room fire with his potions reading, and Hermione sat on the other side of the fire with her charms notes, and Ron was sprawled on the hearthrug arguing about Quidditch positions with Neville, who had no opinions about Quidditch but was finding that having opinions defended on his behalf was a reasonable substitute for having them himself. The fire was warm. The castle was quiet in the way of large things settling into themselves for the night. Outside, Hogwarts went about the ancient business of being Hogwarts, stairs moving, portraits conferring, something making an unexplained noise on the 4th floor that nobody had investigated in 40 years and nobody particularly wanted to start. Inside, Harry turned a page. The year had begun. Chapter 4, The Sorting of Powers. Dumbledore's reply arrived the next morning. Not by owl. By the simple fact that when Harry came down to breakfast, McGonagall was waiting at the bottom of the common room stairs with her hands folded and the expression of someone who has been given a task and is going to complete it to exactly the standard required, no more and no less. "The headmaster," she said, "will see you at 4 this afternoon. Do you know where his office is?" "No," Harry said. "Gargoyle on the 3rd floor corridor, East Wing. The password is Sherbet Lemon." She paused, just fractionally. "He wanted me to tell you that's not a reference to anything, he simply likes them." All right, Harry said. She turned to go. He said, Professor McGonagall. She turned back. You were my parents' head of house. Something shifted in her face, not the complicated reverence, not the calculated wariness, something older and more personal. I was, she said. What were they like? At school? McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Around them, students were coming down from dormitories, the morning noise of Gryffindor Tower building toward its usual comfortable chaos. She looked at Harry with those precise eyes, and whatever she was working through behind them resolved into something direct. Your mother was one of the finest students I taught in 40 years, she said. Exceptional technical ability and the moral clarity to use it properly. Your father was, talented, occasionally exasperating, and underneath the performance, genuinely good. A pause. They were very much in love, which made them occasionally difficult to separate in classes they shared. The corner of her mouth moved. You have her eyes and his habit of arriving at correct conclusions before you've technically been given enough information. Harry absorbed that. Thank you, he said, and meant it precisely. She nodded once and walked away, and Harry went to breakfast with something warm sitting in his chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite happiness but was related to both. The first charms class was Flitwick, who was small and enthusiastic and had the particular energy of someone who genuinely loved their subject the way you can only love something you've spent a lifetime with, not the love that overlooks flaws but the love that knows the flaws completely and chooses the thing anyway. He stood on a pile of books to see over the demonstration desk and explained wand movement theory with the rapid, layered clarity of someone who distilled 40 years of teaching into the most efficient possible form. Harry liked him immediately and without qualification. Hermione was in her element, her hand up before Flitwick finished half his sentences, not showing off but genuinely engaged, asking the kind of questions that took the topic somewhere further than the lesson plan had intended to go. Flitwick met every question with obvious delight, answered it fully, and then used it as a bridge to something even more interesting. The theory of Wingardium Leviosa, Flitwick was explaining, when he stopped himself. Actually, Mr. Potter. The Wingardium component derives from a Latin Old English compound, the Leviosa from Classical Latin. Can anyone tell me why the incantation for a levitation charm would be constructed from two different linguistic roots? Harry looked up. The class was quiet, not the blank quiet of no one knowing, the slightly uncertain quiet of several people knowing something but not being sure it was the right thing. Because the charm was developed at the junction of two separate theoretical traditions, Harry said. Continental magic and British Isles magic fused during the early medieval period. The fusion incantations reflect that, they're compound words because they were built by practitioners working across two frameworks simultaneously. Most basic first-year charms have that structure. He paused. The Wingardium also preserves a proto-magical word root that appears in 4 other levitation-adjacent spells, which suggests the original continental practitioners were working from a shared theoretical vocabulary that predates the Roman period. The silence that followed had a particular quality. Flitwick was looking at him with the specific expression of a teacher who has unexpectedly found someone operating 3 floors above the current lesson. 5 points to Gryffindor, he said, and then, with barely contained excitement, where did you read that? The Architecture of Ancient Houses, Harry said. Chapter 7 has a section on incantation etymology. And I found a paper in the Muggle Studies section of the Hogwarts library yesterday. Someone cross-referenced magical incantation roots with pre-Roman Celtic linguistic structures. It was interesting. That paper, Flitwick said, slightly breathless, was published 40 years ago and has been cited twice. By me. He looked at Harry with genuine wonder. Come see me during office hours this week, Mr. Potter. I have some follow-up reading that I think you'll find rather exciting. Hermione gave Harry the look she gave him when she was pleased about something and was trying to decide how competitive to feel about it. He gave her back the look that said you would have gotten there in 2 more questions. She seemed to find this acceptable. Ron, beside him, said quietly, "Is every class going to be like this?" "Probably not," Harry said. History of magic is going to be terrible. Ron stared at him. That's the most worrying thing you've said so far. He wasn't wrong. History of magic was a ghost, literally, Professor Binns having apparently died one evening and come back the next morning with such force of professional habit that nobody had told him, who delivered facts with the same engaged warmth you'd expect from a very old piece of furniture. The facts themselves were interesting. Harry had already read most of them and wanted to discuss them, which was not an option Binns provided. He spent the class reading ahead in the textbook and trying not to think about what an engaged teacher of this subject could do with the material. Hermione spent it taking notes at the speed and density of someone transcribing a legal document. Ron spent it asleep with his eyes open, which was a skill Harry hadn't previously known existed. At precisely 4 o'clock Harry said the password to the gargoyle on the 3rd floor, watched the stone creature step aside with surprising grace, and rode the moving spiral staircase up to Dumbledore's office. The room was exactly what he'd expected and still managed to be more. It was circular and warm and full of the specific clutter of a very long and very active life, instruments Harry didn't recognize making sounds he couldn't categorize, portraits of previous headmasters asleep in their frames or pretending to be, shelves of books that had the look of things that had been read rather than displayed. A large bird, red and gold, sat on a perch behind the desk and watched Harry come in with eyes that were ancient in a way the bird's appearance didn't suggest. A phoenix. Harry looked at it for a moment, then deliberately looked away, because that was information and information needed processing, not performing. Dumbledore was standing by the window. He turned when Harry entered, and the full force of his attention was notable. Not aggressive, nothing like that. More like standing in a room where the light source was unexpectedly strong and coming from a different direction than you'd anticipated. "Harry," he said, warmly, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please, sit down. Can I offer you a sherbet lemon? They really are very good." "No thank you," Harry said, sitting. He looked at the desk between them, covered in papers, a pensive to one side, the ordinary organized chaos of someone managing a lot simultaneously. "I appreciate you meeting with me promptly." "I appreciate you writing directly," Dumbledore said, settling into his own chair with the ease of someone for whom that particular chair was an extension of their thinking. "I've been wondering how you'd approach this conversation." "How did you think I'd approach it?" "Carefully," Dumbledore said. "And so you have." His eyes, very blue, very old, rested on Harry with the complicated quality Harry had noticed at the sorting feast. "You wanted answers to specific questions. Would you like to ask them, or would you prefer I begin?" "You begin," Harry said. "I want to know what you know about what you did, before I tell you what I know. It'll save time." A beat. Something in Dumbledore's expression moved, surprise, genuine and unperformed, and then something that might have been respect, and then something older than either, something tired. "When your parents died," Dumbledore said, without preamble, which Harry appreciated, "I made several decisions rapidly. I placed you with your mother's sister because the blood protection her proximity offered you was the strongest defensive magic I could provide. The killing curse had rebounded from you, something unprecedented had happened, something I didn't fully understand, and the most urgent priority was keeping you alive while I worked out what had occurred." "And the estates," Harry said. "The legal structures." "I was aware of them," Dumbledore said, and here his voice carried something that was not quite heaviness but adjacent to it. "I made a choice to not initiate the inheritance process immediately. I told myself it was because you needed an ordinary childhood, free from the weight of those responsibilities, free from the attention that the titles would have brought." "Did you believe that at the time?" A longer pause than before. "I believed some of it," Dumbledore said. "I also believed, and I want to be honest with you, Harry, because I think you deserve that far more than you deserve comfort, that a child without knowledge of their power was more easily protected. And more easily guided." Harry looked at him steadily. Guided toward what? The question sat between them. The Phoenix, Fox, Harry knew the name from Ollivander's card, made a low, soft sound. "Toward facing Voldemort," Dumbledore said, and said the name without flinching, without the euphemism. That is the truth of it. I knew, even then, that the confrontation was not over. That Voldemort was not destroyed, merely diminished. And I knew that you would be central to whatever came next. The prophecy made that clear. There's a prophecy. There is. About me specifically. About you and Voldemort, yes. Harry breathed through this carefully. You've known the content of a prophecy about my life since before I could walk, he said, and you chose not to tell me. Yes. No qualification. No but. Just yes, and the full weight of it, and Dumbledore sitting with that weight rather than deflecting it. Where is the prophecy now? In the Department of Mysteries, Dumbledore said. In the Hall of Prophecy. In a glass sphere with your name and Voldemort's on the label. It can only be retrieved by the subject of it. He looked at Harry carefully. Only you can remove it from its shelf. Harry filed this. Tell me what it says. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, Dumbledore said quietly. Born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. And the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not. And either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born as the 7th month dies. The room was very quiet. Either must die at the hand of the other, Harry said. That is what it says. That's why you wanted me ignorant and isolated, Harry said. It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation, stated plainly because it was true. Not just protected. You thought if I didn't know, I'd be more likely to accept whatever role you determined I needed to play. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. I thought, he said carefully, that knowledge of that weight would crush a child. It might crush one who didn't know what to do with it, Harry said. I know what to do with it. And what is that? Prepare for it systematically rather than stumble into it emotionally. Harry leaned forward slightly. Voldemort isn't gone. Something of him survived. You know where. Dumbledore looked at him for a long, careful moment. You've worked that out already. Quirrell smells of something that's been dead for a while and isn't quite, Harry said. And he won't meet my eyes, which isn't a personality trait, it's avoidance behavior, the kind that's physical rather than social. Something is in that man that doesn't want to be looked at. He paused. I want to know what you know about the object in the 3rd floor corridor. A beat that stretched. How do you know about the 3rd floor corridor? Because you announced at the sorting feast that students should avoid it if they didn't want to die, Harry said. Which is the kind of statement that creates more curiosity than it prevents, and which means either you wanted students to know something was there or you dramatically underestimated how 11-year-olds respond to information. Given your general intelligence, I'm assuming the first. Something that might, in a different moment, have been a smile passed across Dumbledore's face. There is an object being stored there, he said. A very powerful one. Its presence is the reason Voldemort, what remains of Voldemort, is here, at Hogwarts, this year. The Philosopher's Stone, Harry said. Dumbledore was quiet. Nicholas Flamel, Harry said. The only confirmed maker of one. His name is in Flamel's alchemical papers, which are in the restricted section, which I haven't accessed yet, but I will. And Gringotts had a break-in attempt this summer, on a vault that was emptied the same day. The prophet reported it briefly before the story stopped appearing, which suggests someone asked them to stop. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. You moved something from Gringotts to Hogwarts because you believed Voldemort would try to take it. And now he's here, inside a defense professor, and you're waiting. Not waiting, Dumbledore said, and his voice had shifted, still warm, but more serious now, more direct, the particular directness of someone who has decided the game is more complicated than anticipated. Watching. Preparing. For what outcome? For the confrontation that the prophecy describes, Dumbledore said. Harry, I want to be clear. I do not intend for you to walk into that third-floor corridor alone. I am not, I want you to understand, whatever else I have done or not done, I am not indifferent to your safety. I know you're not, Harry said. I think you love me, in the way you can love someone you've decided is important before they've had a chance to be a person. He said it without cruelty. I also think your love has historically taken the form of making decisions on my behalf. I'd like that to change. You can love me and tell me the truth simultaneously. Those things aren't in conflict. The room was quiet for a long time. Then Dumbledore said, I have been doing this for a very long time, Harry. Carrying knowledge. Making decisions. Accepting the weight of them. I know, Harry said. I'm not asking you to stop being who you are. I'm asking you to talk to me like I'm capable of handling what's true. He leaned back. I'm 11 years old and I've restructured 12 ministry departments. I think we can probably have an honest conversation. Something in Dumbledore's face, something old and careful and long defended, shifted. Not collapsed. Nothing so dramatic. Just, opened, slightly. Like a window in a room that hadn't had fresh air in years. Ask me your questions, he said. All of them. I'll answer what I can. Harry asked. Dumbledore answered. They talked for 2 hours, and by the end of it Harry knew more about his parents' lives and deaths than he'd known that morning, more about the prophecy and its specific weight, more about Voldemort's history and the various theories about his survival. He also knew, with growing certainty, several things about Quirrell that he hadn't been able to confirm before. He left the office at 6 with his mind sorted into ordered categories and his chest full of something he couldn't quite name, not happiness, not sadness, not even the satisfied click of information falling into place. Something more like the feeling of finally standing in a room you'd been told didn't exist and finding it real. He went straight to the library. Not the main section, the restricted section, for which McGonagall had given first-year students extremely limited access for specific class requirements. He didn't need that access. He had something better. As controlling stakeholder in the Department of Magical Education, Harry had, in the joint governance agreement Fudge had signed, a clause about institutional resource access for purposes of estate management and oversight. It was a clause Hookthorne at Gringotts had drafted with quiet precision, and which Harry had read 3 times to make sure he understood exactly what it permitted. It permitted him to access any educational resource at institutions funded by or administratively connected to the Department of Magical Education. Hogwarts received ministry funding through that department. He walked to Madame Pance's desk, placed the relevant document in front of her, a copy, certified by Gringotts, neat and legible, and said, politely, I need access to the full restricted section for research relevant to the estate management oversight of the department's educational mandate. This is the authorizing document. Madame Pance read it. She read it twice, with the precision of someone who had managed library access for 30 years and had encountered most of the creative approaches humans deploy when they want books they're not supposed to have. Her expression moved through several stages, ending somewhere in the territory of professional acknowledgement. The restricted section, she said, closes at 9. I'll be out by 8:30, Harry said. She gave him the pass. He found Flamel's alchemical papers in 40 minutes, confirmed everything he'd suspected about the stone in 20 more, and spent the remaining time on a different shelf entirely, a section on magical oaths and their legal standing, which was relevant to something he'd been thinking about since the conversation with Dumbledore. Specifically, he was thinking about Severus Snape. He'd been in the library 20 minutes when Hermione arrived, which surprised him for about 4 seconds before it stopped surprising him. She found him by following the trail of pulled and replaced volumes, which was apparently how she tracked people. Restricted section, she said. How? He showed her the document. She read it with the focus she gave everything, and then looked at him with something complicated behind her eyes. You planned for this. I planned for broad institutional access, Harry said. I didn't specifically plan for the library. But it fits within the clause. Do you know what you're looking for? I know what I found, he said, and told her about the stone. He'd been considering whether to, and had concluded that Hermione with information was considerably more useful than Hermione without it, and that she'd figure out most of it independently anyway, and that the time saved by telling her directly was worth more than whatever caution had argued for waiting. She absorbed the information rapidly. Quirrell, she said. Yes. Since the start of term. Probably since before. The Gringotts break-in was July. She sat down across from him and pulled the nearest relevant volume toward her with the automatic gesture of someone who processes things best while holding a book. What are you planning to do about it? Monitor Quirrell closely, Harry said. Keep Dumbledore informed through the conversation we're now having. I told him what I know, he confirmed and added to it. And prepare for the possibility that whatever Voldemort is trying to do, it accelerates. The stone, Hermione said. If Voldemort gets it, he returns to full power. Yes. So the question is whether the protections on the third-floor corridor are sufficient to prevent that. The question, Harry said, is what we do if they're not. She looked at him across the table. What do you need from me? It was such a direct question, asked in such a direct way, without performance or negotiation, that it produced something unexpected, a straightforward warmth, uncomplicated. Keep your eyes on things, he said. You notice everything anyway. I want you to specifically watch Quirrell in defense class. Note anything that seems off. Document it. He paused. And if I'm ever about to do something genuinely stupid, tell me. Define genuinely stupid, she said. You'll know it when you see it. Your judgment is good. She looked at him steadily. That's the most useful compliment anyone has ever given me, she said. And I am aware that's a slightly sad statement about my social history. Your social history is about to change significantly, Harry said. You're at Hogwarts now and you've already been to the restricted section once. Things are looking up. The corner of her mouth moved. She pulled the alchemical papers toward her and began reading. The letter from Gringotts arrived on a Thursday, forwarded through the school owl post, and its contents required Harry to do something he hadn't yet done at Hogwarts, use the formal channels of his institutional authority within the school's own structure. The Wizengamot Financial Committee had received the audit summary. Their response, which Sharpblade had forwarded with a note that expressed, in extremely professional goblin terms, something very close to contempt, was a request for a 90-day extension before beginning the restitution schedule discussion, on the grounds that several committee members needed time to review the relevant documentation thoroughly. Several of those committee members had signatures on the relevant documentation. In the section about where the money had gone, Harry read the letter twice. Then he went to McGonagall's office. She was always in, grading third-year transfiguration essays with the focused efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for decades and hadn't stopped finding it occasionally interesting. She looked up when he knocked. Potter, she said. Sit down. He sat. He placed the Gringotts letter on her desk. She read it, and he watched her expression do something precise and controlled that nonetheless communicated that she found the Wizengamot's response professionally objectionable. What do you need, she said. The school's owl post facility for a ministry-addressed letter that requires official seal, Harry said. Under the Joint Governance Clause, I can correspond directly with the Wizengamot's oversight structures. I need Hogwarts' address on the seal rather than Gringotts, because I want to make clear that this isn't just a bank complaint, it's correspondence from a minor who is also a legal stakeholder and who is currently in educational residence at an institution funded by the same departments under review. McGonagall looked at him. You want Hogwarts' institutional weight behind the letter. I want the accurate picture, Harry said. I'm not trying to use the school, I just happen to be here, and that's relevant context. She picked up her official seal without further comment and pressed it to the blank corner of a piece of Hogwarts parchment, which she slid across the desk to him. Use this as your letterhead. Dumbledore would want to know you've sent it. I'd suggest informing him. I already have a standing communication with him, Harry said. He's aware of the general situation. Good. She took the Gringotts letter back, read it a second time, set it down with the deliberateness of someone making sure a thing stays where they put it. For what it's worth, Potter, and I am stating this strictly as an observation rather than official school opinion, the 90-day request is, in my personal view, the kind of procedural avoidance that has been permitted to function for far too long. I know, Harry said. That's why I'm writing back today rather than in 90 days. She made a sound that was absolutely not a laugh. Use the school owlery. 3rd floor, past the tapestry. He wrote the letter in the corridor outside her office, concise, specific, formally addressed, making clear that the 90-day extension was not acceptable under the terms of the restitution agreement that Fudge had signed, that the audit findings were already a matter of public legal record, and that further delay would result in a Gringotts-initiated formal escalation to the International Confederation of Wizards' financial oversight body, which had jurisdiction in cases involving institutional misconduct by national magical governments. The escalation to the International Confederation was technically possible. He'd confirmed this with Hookthorn before school started. It would be complicated and slow, but it existed, and the Wiesengemotts committee would know it existed, and that was what mattered. He sent the letter with the largest, most authoritative-looking school owl he could find. Snape's second potions class was a practical, the first actual brewing session, and Harry was partnered with Ron, which suited both of them. Ron had a practical competence with the physical aspect of potions that his general academic anxiety obscured, good hands, good instincts for heat and timing, the kind of spatial intelligence that made the stirring patterns come naturally. The potion was a simple one. Boil Cure, for obvious reasons given the average 11-year-old's decision-making around cauldron safety. Halfway through the class, Neville's cauldron had produced something that was less a boil cure and more a boil cause, and Snape had appeared at Neville's station with the particular stillness of someone who was deciding what form a correction was going to take. Longbottom, Snape said, with a precision that could have been anything. What has gone wrong? Not a question. Neville looked at the cauldron. His face had gone red. I added the porcupine quills before removing the cauldron from the heat, Snape said. Which is, as the instructions explicitly state, the single most critical sequencing error in this potion. He looked at Neville's notes, then at Neville. You copied the instructions correctly. You read them correctly. You simply didn't follow them. I got confused about the sequence, Neville said quietly. Confusion in potions, Snape said, produces at best a failed potion. At worst, it produces, he looked at the cauldron. The surface was bubbling in a way that wasn't decorative. Move back, Longbottom. Neville moved back. Snape vanished the cauldron's contents with a practiced wand movement and produced a clean cauldron from the store cupboard, setting it in front of Neville without comment. Start again, he said. Read each instruction before you perform it, not after. If you complete it with a passing result, your grade reflects the original attempt. Neville blinked. Yes, Professor. Snape moved away. It was not kindness, exactly, there was no warmth in it, no comfort. But it was, specific correction rather than punishment, which was a distinction Harry filed carefully. It didn't match the portrait of Snape he'd built from various documents and references, and it was more interesting than that portrait. At the end of class, as students began clearing their stations, Snape moved to Harry's bench and looked at the completed potion, clear, correct color, appropriately viscous. Your technique is adequate, Snape said. Weasley's handling is better than mine, Harry said. He's more precise with the stirring patterns. I'm better with the preparation sequences. Snape looked at Ron, who appeared to be considering becoming invisible. Then he looked back at Harry with those dark, assessing eyes. A balanced partnership. Most useful ones are, Harry said. A pause that felt like something being decided. You'll stay after class, Potter. Ron shot Harry a look as he packed up that communicated several things, most of them concerned. Harry gave him a look back that communicated it's fine and hoped he was right. When the class had emptied, Snape stood at the front of the room and looked at Harry with the particular expression Harry was beginning to identify as his version of thinking, not blank, not calculating, just processing, somewhere behind those eyes, running information through frameworks the rest of his face didn't reveal. "The Joint Governance Board," Snape said. "You've established review rights over the Department of Magical Education." "Yes. That department has direct administrative influence over school curriculum standards." "It does. You are currently enrolled at a school," Snape said carefully, "whose curriculum falls under that administrative influence." Harry looked at him. "I haven't used the access for anything relating to Hogwarts curriculum," he said. "My restricted section access is through a different clause, institutional resource access, not curriculum oversight." "I know," Snape said. "I read the governance agreement carefully when it was released. The curriculum clause concerns me for a different reason." He was quiet for a moment. "Defense against the dark arts. The curriculum at this school has been insufficient for some time. The staffing difficulties compound this. First-year students are receiving theoretical instruction from someone who is in no condition to teach anything effectively." It was the most he'd said about Quirrell without saying Quirrell's name. Harry looked at him steadily. "Are you asking me to do something about it?" "I'm informing you," Snape said, "of a curriculum deficiency that falls within the review mandate of the governance structure you've established." His eyes held Harry's. "What you do with that information is your decision." Harry thought about Dumbledore's office and the conversation about the stone. "You know what's wrong with Quirrell?" Snape's expression didn't change. "I know several things," he said. "Some of them I cannot act on directly without revealing knowledge I should not have. Others," he stopped. A very deliberate, very controlled stop. "You're watching him," Harry said. "I am doing what I do," Snape said, "which is my business and not yours, Mr. Potter." The final 3 words landed with a precision that closed the subject. "The defense curriculum. That is yours, if you choose to make it so." Harry nodded. "I'll look at the curriculum standards tonight." Snape looked at him for another moment. Something moved behind those eyes, complicated, layered, the kind of thing that had a long history attached to it that Harry didn't have access to yet but suspected he would eventually. "You look like your father," Snape said, with the neutral tone of someone stating a fact they've decided to manage rather than feel. "You are not very much like him." "I've been told that," Harry said. "I take it as a compliment, though I suspect you're not offering it as one." "I'm offering it as an observation," Snape said. "Your mother was the better strategist of the two. She could read a room before she'd crossed the threshold. You have that." He turned back to his desk. "Good afternoon, Potter." Harry left. In the corridor, he stood still for a moment and let the conversation arrange itself in his mind, the layers of it, what had been said under what had been said. Snape was watching Quirrell. Snape knew something he wasn't able to act on directly. Snape had just, in the most indirect possible way, asked Harry to create the legal framework for removing Quirrell from his position. He went to find his potions textbook and the joint governance agreement document. That evening, Ron found him in a common room with 6 documents spread across the table and a quill moving between them. "What are you doing?" Ron asked, with the tone of someone who could see the answer was going to be complicated. "Writing a curriculum review request to the Department of Magical Education's Joint Oversight Board," Harry said. "Citing deficiencies in the Defense Against the Dark Arts program at this institution, with specific reference to instructor effectiveness metrics." Ron pulled up a chair. "You're firing Quirrell." "I'm requesting a curriculum review that will result in an evaluation of instructor performance in the relevant subject area," Harry said. "Quirrell can respond to that evaluation. If his performance is found deficient, which it will be," Ron said, "because he's terrified of everything including his own lessons. Then the review board recommends remediation or replacement," Harry said. "Which is the proper institutional process?" Ron looked at the documents. He picked up the top one, read 3 paragraphs, put it down. You're going to actually do this. I'm already doing it, Harry said. And Quirrell just goes. He loses his job because of a curriculum review. He loses his job because the curriculum review reveals that the defense program hasn't met standards in 6 years, Harry said, and that the current instructor's performance metrics are demonstrably inadequate, and that students at this institution are not receiving the practical defensive education they need given the current threat environment. He looked at Ron. That's all true. I'm not inventing a reason to remove him. I'm documenting the real one. Ron was quiet for a moment. Dad would say, he said slowly, working through it, that the ministry's been letting things slide for years because nobody wanted to make the argument loudly enough. And that people who don't want to make the argument loudly enough usually have a reason they're not mentioning. Your dad's right, Harry said. Ron looked at the documents again. Then he said, what can I do? Harry looked at him. In the firelight Ron's face was open and direct, no performance about it, just, offered. The question and its full weight, genuinely given. Sit with me, Harry said. Tell me if the logic holds. You're good at knowing when something doesn't add up, even when you can't say why. Ron considered this. I'm not clever the way you and Hermione are clever. You're clever in a different way, Harry said. Which is more useful than being the same kind of clever twice. Ron thought about this for a moment. Then he sat down, pulled one of the secondary documents toward him, and started reading with the careful concentration of someone who decided to take the thing seriously. They worked until Hermione came down from her revision. She'd been in the dormitory doing Charm's homework 3 hours ahead of when it was due, which surprised nobody, and found them at the table, and pulled up a third chair without being asked. The fire crackled. Outside Hogwarts the Scottish night was dark and clear and vast, and the stars over the Black Lake were the same stars they'd always been, indifferent to governance restructures and curriculum reviews and whatever was wearing Quirrell's face on the 3rd floor. Inside, 3 11-year-olds worked on the documents until McGonagall came through at 9 to tell them to go to bed, read what was on the table, stood still for precisely 3 seconds, and said, 10 minutes, Potter. Then bed. She walked back to her quarters and didn't look at the table again. Neville, coming down for a glass of water, found them packing up at 9:10 and said, looking at the official ministry-headed documents, is anyone going to tell me what's happening? Eventually, Ron said. Biscuit? Neville took a biscuit. He sat on the end of the sofa and ate it and looked at Harry with those wide, honest eyes. Whatever you're doing, he said. I want to help. I know I'm not as good as you lot at the clever parts. But I could, he stopped. I'm good at other things. I think. I just haven't worked out what yet. Harry looked at him. Thought about what McGonagall had said about his mother, moral clarity. Thought about the specific, uncalculated courage of someone saying give it back in a voice that shook. You're braver than you know, Harry said. And that's not a small thing. Neville went slightly pink but held his ground, which was itself an illustration of the point. Harry tucked the curriculum review under his arm and went to bed, and lay awake for exactly long enough to feel the weight of all of it, Dumbledore's honesty and its limits, Snape's layers, the stone sitting behind its protections 3 floors above him, Quirrell walking through corridors with a dead lord hiding at the back of his head. Then he went to sleep. He had things to do in the morning. Chapter 5, The Ministry Bleeds. The audit results went public on a Wednesday. Harry knew the exact moment it happened because the owl post at breakfast became briefly insane, not just the usual morning delivery but a cascade of birds arriving at intervals over 20 minutes, dropping papers and letters, and in one case a howler that addressed itself to the ceiling rather than any particular person and screamed about governmental overreach for approximately 45 seconds before incinerating itself. The Great Hall watched this with the communal attention of people who have just understood that the thing they were reading about in the newspaper is now happening around them. The Daily Prophet front page was Lavinia Blight's, which Harry was quietly glad about. The headline was clean and factual: Gringotts audit reveals decade of ministry financial misconduct, full findings released to Wisengamot. The subheading named 4 specific departments and 3 named officials whose signatures appeared on the irregular drawdown requests. It did not editorialize. It presented the documented findings and let them be what they were. The second article, further down the front page, smaller, was Skeeter's, and it was about Harry. It described him as a child puppet of goblin financial interests, which was so wrong in so many specific ways that he almost admired the creativity. "She called you a puppet," Ron said, reading over his shoulder. "She called me a puppet of goblin financial interests specifically," Harry said. "Which suggests she's been talking to someone who wants people to be angry at goblins rather than at the officials whose signatures are on the drawdown requests." Hermione had already identified the logical gap. "The officials named in Blight's article," she said, not looking up from her copy. "2 of them are connected to families whose names appear in the Malfoy correspondence records that were quoted in the Rita Skeeter piece from August." She looked up. "That's not a coincidence." "No," Harry agreed. "Lucius Malfoy is managing the narrative," she said. "Trying to redirect the public response away from the ministry officials and toward the process itself. Make the audit look like an attack rather than a finding. He's good at it," Harry said, which was simply true. Ron was frowning at Skeeter's article. "The goblin puppet thing. That's going to stick with people who don't read carefully." "Most people don't read carefully," Harry said. "Which is why Blight's article matters more than Skeeter's in the long run. The facts in it are documented in public record, so when people eventually want to verify what actually happened, the information's there." He folded the paper. "In the short run, Skeeter's framing will circulate more. That's fine. We're playing a longer game." Ron looked at him. "Do you find anything alarming?" "Yes," Harry said. "Several things. I just don't let alarming things change the strategy if the strategy's right." Neville, who had been eating porridge throughout this conversation with the focused attention of someone processing a great deal simultaneously, said, "My Gran wrote me this morning." He held up a letter. "She says, I can read it if you want to share it," Harry said. Neville read, "The audit findings confirm what decent people have suspected for years. The question is not whether the situation is shameful, which it clearly is, but whether anything will actually be done about it, which in my experience of the ministry is far from guaranteed. I hope your friend Mr. Potter understands that revealing a problem and solving it are 2 very different things, and that the people with the most to lose from a solution are frequently the most determined opponents of one. Tell him Augusta Longbottom has seen 3 reform attempts in 40 years. None of them reached a conclusion. He should know what he's up against." The table was quiet for a moment. "She sounds formidable," Hermione said. "She's terrifying," Neville said, with the particular warmth of someone describing something terrifying that they also love. "She means it as a warning. But I think she also means it as, she's paying attention. That's a lot, from her." Harry looked at Neville's letter. Augusta Longbottom had been fighting the same war, in the way available to someone inside the system rather than across it from the outside, for 4 decades. She knew the shape of the opposition better than he did yet. "Write her back," Harry said. "Ask her what the 3 reform attempts had in common. What stopped them? Specific as she can be." Neville looked at him. "You're going to use her knowledge." "I'm going to not make the same mistakes," Harry said. "There's a difference." The Quirrell Curriculum Review response came back from the Joint Oversight Board 11 days after Harry had submitted it, which was faster than he'd expected and suggested someone on the board had been waiting for exactly this kind of formal trigger. The response was careful in the way of official documents written by people who knew what they were doing. It acknowledged the review request, confirmed jurisdiction, and indicated that an inspector would visit Hogwarts within the month to conduct a formal evaluation of the Defense Against the Dark Arts program. Harry read it in the corridor outside the Ollery and sent a brief update to Sharpblade before breakfast. What he hadn't anticipated, and what he acknowledged to himself as a genuine miscalculation, was how quickly Quirrell would find out. Defense class that afternoon had a different quality to it the moment Harry walked through the door. Not atmosphere exactly, more like the particular alertness of a room where something has already been decided before the students arrived. Quirrell was at the front, his turban slightly more askew than usual, his hands moving with their habitual anxious fidget. But his eyes, when they moved to Harry, stopped. Not for long. Half a second, maybe less. But they stopped, and in that half-second they were not Quirrell's eyes, not the pale, slightly watery eyes of a nervous man giving a nervous lesson. They were something else. Something older and colder and not even slightly nervous. Harry met them. Held them. Didn't look away. The half-second passed. Quirrell blinked, looked down at his notes, began explaining the theoretical principles of counterjinxes in his usual stammer. Harry took out his notebook and wrote, "He knows about the review. The other one knows." He passed it to Ron under the desk. Ron read it, passed it to Hermione. Hermione wrote underneath, "How do you want to handle today's class?" Harry wrote, "Normally. Completely normally. Don't give him anything to react to." They handled it normally. They took notes on counterjinxes, asked appropriate questions, performed the minor practical exercises with appropriate results. Quirrell's lesson was, as always, theoretically adequate and practically useless, the kind of teaching that covers its own tracks by being technically correct about everything and meaningfully useful about nothing. Afterward, in the corridor, Neville said quietly, the back of his turban. During the practical section, when everyone was moving around. The turban moved. Harry looked at him. Moved how? Like something inside it shifted, Neville said. Like it was, turning. To look at something. He stopped. I know how that sounds. It sounds exactly like what I think it is, Harry said. Good eyes, Neville. Neville straightened slightly. It was a small thing, but it happened every time, when told specifically that something he'd done was right, not in the general reassuring way but the specific accurate way, something in him stood up straighter. Harry made a point of doing it when it was true, which was more often than Neville currently understood. The letter from Lucius Malfoy arrived on a Saturday. It came addressed to Harry Potter, care of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, sealed with the Malfoy crest in black wax, which was elegant and also a statement. Harry opened it over breakfast while Ron watched with the expression of someone watching someone else open a suspicious package. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first expressed, with careful courtesy, Lucius's concern about the effect of the public audit release on ministry staff morale and institutional stability. The second suggested that Harry, as a stakeholder with genuine interest in ministry effectiveness, might want to consider the unintended consequences of rapid institutional disruption. The third, and this was the paragraph Harry read 3 times, stated that several members of the Wisengamot Senior Council were prepared to open a legal challenge to the validity of the original purchasing agreements, on the grounds that the dormancy clauses had expired during a period of active estate mismanagement, and that activation of agreements under those circumstances might constitute a conflict of interest. It was an intelligent argument. Not correct, Hookthorne had reviewed the dormancy clauses with meticulous care, but genuinely intelligent. The kind of legal challenge that wasn't designed to win in court but to create enough delay and uncertainty that the political will to continue the process eroded before a verdict was reached. Harry set the letter down and ate a piece of toast. Bad? Ron asked. Clever, Harry said. He's found a legal angle. It won't hold, but it doesn't need to hold. It just needs to create enough noise that people start asking whether the whole thing is legitimate before the audit findings have had time to settle. So what do we do? We call his bluff, Harry said, and reached for his quill. He wrote to Hookthorne first, alert them, get the specific counter-precedents ready, and prepare for a Wisengamot hearing on the validity question within the next month. He wrote to Sharpblade second, the same information, with the addition that if a legal challenge was filed, Gringotts should be prepared to file simultaneous counterdocumentation establishing the clean chain of inheritance for each purchasing agreement individually. Not all at once, but staggered, 1 per week, keeping the story continuous and documented in public record. He wrote a third letter. This one to Lavinia Blight. The Malfoy family is preparing a legal challenge to the purchasing agreements. The argument is about dormancy clause activation during estate mismanagement. Hookthorn at Gringotts can walk you through why this argument is technically incorrect. I'd suggest calling him directly. The story is that the challenge is being filed not to win, but to create delay. That's newsworthy. The documentation supporting the original agreements is thorough and will be made available on record. Would you want to cover the hearing if one is called? He signed it, folded it, sent it. Hermione had been reading the Malfoy letter while he wrote. She set it down. He's also buying time for something else, she said. Harry looked at her. Yes. He sent this letter knowing you'd spend the morning responding to it. Yes. So what's happening this morning that he doesn't want you focused on? It was a good question. Harry pushed back from the table. Let's find out. What was happening that morning was happening in Hogsmeade, which Harry couldn't reach directly, but Hermione had worked out a different route to the same answer. The Prophet Afternoon edition, which arrived by owl at the school around 1 o'clock, had a small piece, not front page, not by Blight, about a meeting of senior Wizengamot members at the Three Broomsticks the previous evening. 12 names were listed as attendees. 4 of them were connected to departments under the audit review. 3 of them were among the officials whose signatures appeared on the irregular drawdown requests. They'd met the night before the Malfoy letter arrived. He's coordinating a block, Hermione said. They were in the library, the usual corner, Crookshanks asleep under the table in a patch of afternoon light. The legal challenge is the public face. The block is the actual mechanism. If enough Wizengamot members vote to pause the audit process pending the challenge outcome, the whole thing stalls regardless of what the legal arguments say. Harry looked at the list of names. How many Wizengamot votes do I hold? She'd already worked it out. Through the Lordship titles, confirmed ones only, you hold proxy voting rights on 22 of 150 seats. Just under 15%. Not enough on its own. No. But if the block is 12 people, she'd done the maths. Then the vote is 12 against 22 if nobody else moves. Which means the block needs more members to be effective, and so does a countervote. Who are the undecided Wizengamot members? Harry said. The ones who haven't publicly aligned with either position yet. Hermione pulled the notebook she'd been compiling for 3 weeks and opened it to a tabbed section. She'd been building a map of Wizengamot alignments from public statements, voting records, and family connections, the way you build a picture from pieces, patient, methodical, comprehensive. She was extraordinary. Harry said so. She looked pleased and then immediately covered the pleased expression with a professional one. There are 43 members with no clear current alignment, she said. Of those, 19 have made positive public statements about the audit findings. 14 have made neutral statements. 10 have made statements that are critical of the process without aligning with the Malfoy position. The 10 critical ones, Harry said. What are their specific criticisms? Speed, mostly. And precedent. They're worried that if a 10-year-old can restructure ministry departments through dormant purchasing agreements, anyone with the right bloodline and the right legal team could do the same. That's a reasonable concern, Harry said. And it's different from the Malfoy position, which is that the agreements are invalid. These 10 are saying the agreements are valid but shouldn't be allowed to work this way. Yes. Harry looked at the names. I need to talk to them. Hermione blinked. The undecided Wizengamot members. The 10 who think the process is the problem rather than the agreements. They're not wrong to be concerned, I'd be concerned too, in their position. The mechanism I used is genuinely powerful and the access requirements should probably be codified more clearly going forward. He looked at Hermione. If I propose a legislative framework that addresses their concern, a formal registry of dormant purchasing agreements, a review process for reactivation, clear standards, they stop being opponents and start being co-authors. Hermione stared at him. You're going to propose a law. I'm going to propose a framework that addresses the legitimate concern behind the opposition, Harry said. Which also happens to make the Malfoy challenge look like what it is, political interference rather than genuine legal principle. Ron, who had been listening from 3 chairs down while nominally playing chess against himself, said, "That's either brilliant or we're first years and this is insane." "Both things are true," Harry said. "Right." Ron tipped his own king over, apparently conceding the chess game to himself on principle. "What do we need?" "Hermione writes the framework, she's the best at making sure the legal language says what it means to say. You read it for sense, tell us if there's any part that sounds like something a person wouldn't actually agree to. I'll write the covering letter and the arguments for each individual member based on their specific concerns." Harry was already pulling parchment out. "We need it done by Tuesday if we want it in front of the Wisengamot secretary before the challenge is formally filed." Ron looked at the pile of parchment. "It's Saturday." 2.5 days, Harry said. "Right," Ron said again, and reached for his own quill with the manner of someone deciding that this was who they were now, and finding they didn't mind. They were in the library until Madame Pants made them leave at 9, and reconvened in the common room until midnight, and were back in the library by 7 Sunday morning with Neville bringing them toast from the Great Hall because he understood that this was a logistics problem as much as an intellectual one, and toast was the part of the logistics problem he could solve. The framework Hermione drafted was clean and specific: a formal dormant purchasing agreement registry, mandatory public disclosure of any such agreements held by any individual or institution with assets above a defined threshold, a standardized review process requiring both Gringotts certification and Wisengamot notification before activation, and a grandfather clause that specifically preserved the validity of Harry's already activated agreements while setting the new standard for any future activations. She read it back to them on Sunday evening and it was good. Properly good, not good for 11 years old but good in the way of things that have been thought through completely. Ron pointed out 3 places where the language was technically correct but would confuse a non-specialist reader. Hermione rewrote them. Harry wrote the covering letters, 10 individual ones, each addressing the specific concern the relevant Wisengamot member had expressed publicly, quoting their own words back to them and explaining how the framework addressed their specific issue. Monday was given to the fair copy. Tuesday morning, Harry handed the complete package to Bureaucrat, the Barn Owl, and sent it to the Wisengamot secretary's office with a covering note that was so polite and clearly documented that even someone who disliked the contents would have difficulty finding grounds to refuse receipt. He went to breakfast and ate normally. In the afternoon he had a free period, which he used to fly. The attack happened on a Wednesday evening. Harry was returning from Flitwick's office hours. They'd been meeting twice a week now, the conversations going further and further from the official curriculum into the actual structure of charms theory, which was the most intellectually alive Harry had felt in a classroom setting since the Gringotts assessment room. He was walking back up from the charms corridor with his bag over his shoulder and his mind still half engaged with the question Flitwick had raised about nonverbal intent modification in complex charm sequences. He became aware of the person behind him 3 seconds before they struck. Not because he heard them, they were good, moving quietly, the footsteps absorbed by the spell they were using, which Harry recognized as a modified silencing charm applied to shoes rather than sound, which was clever. He was aware of them because of something more instinctive, something he'd developed over 10 years of a life where threats came from unexpected directions and the difference between anticipating them and not was the difference between being okay and not being okay. He stepped sideways, into the alcove between a suit of armor and the wall, and the hex that had been aimed at his back hit the suit of armor instead with a crash that echoed impressively through the corridor. His wand was in his hand. He didn't remember drawing it. That was the thing about training. He'd been practicing every evening in the empty classroom on the 2nd floor, working through the spells in his books with the methodical focus he'd given everything else, and the body remembers what the mind has made habitual. 2 of them. Both masked, plain white, not Death Eater masks, nothing ideological about it, just anonymous. Both adult-sized, both holding wands. The one who'd cast was already adjusting aim. Harry cast Expelliarmus at the nearest one and Protego simultaneously, which he'd been told was theoretically possible but practically very advanced. It turned out to be practically possible as well. The disarming spell caught the nearer attacker in the chest and sent their wand spinning. The shield stopped the second hex that came from the other direction and it broke apart against it like water against glass. The disarmed attacker, without a wand now, turned and ran. The other one held position, which was either courage or calculation, and cast something heavier, not a hex but something that hit Harry's hastily erected second shield with real force and pushed him back a step. He let himself go back. Used the momentum, dropped below the line of fire, cast Stupefy low and fast. It connected. The second attacker dropped. Harry stood in the corridor with his wand steady and his breathing elevated but controlled, and approximately 47 things happening in his head simultaneously, the most urgent of which was the identification of what had just occurred and what it meant. Someone had tried to incapacitate him in a Hogwarts corridor. On a Wednesday evening. With professional precision that suggested they were not students and not improvising. He looked at the stunned figure on the floor. Pulled the mask off. He didn't know the face. Middle-aged, sharp-featured, no immediately recognizable identifying marks. He performed a quick incarcerus, the ropes appearing and binding the figure with neat efficiency, and then, because he was in a school, went to find a professor. He found McGonagall. She was the right choice, closest office, and the right temperament for this specific kind of situation. She took one look at his face, one look at the corridor behind him, and said, "Come," in the voice that didn't invite questions, and they went back together. She looked at the bound figure. She looked at the unconscious state. She looked at Harry. "Are you injured?" she asked. "No. You did this." Not a question. "Yes." She looked at the figure for another moment. Then she cast a Patronus, a large silver cat, which moved with the economy and purpose that McGonagall brought to everything, and sent it to Dumbledore. She cast a second one and sent it somewhere else, which Harry didn't recognize. "The second Patronus," Harry said. "Aurors," she said shortly. "Sit down, Potter." Against the wall. He sat. She stood over the bound figure with her wand not quite pointed at it and an expression that communicated she was absolutely prepared to use it. "There were two," Harry said. "The other one ran." They were using a modified silencing charm on their movement, not standard aura technique, something more specialized. "When did you notice them?" 3 seconds before the first cast. McGonagall looked at him. It was the kind of look that was trying to decide something. "You've been practicing." "Every evening," Harry said. "The empty classroom on the second floor." "I hope that's all right." "It is," she said, in the tone of someone who is going to make sure of that retroactively if necessary. "What spells did you use?" He told her. She was quiet. "Simultaneous Expelliarmus and Protego," she said. "Theoretically possible," Harry said. "Practically very advanced for a first year," she said. "I've been practicing," he said again. She said nothing else. Dumbledore arrived 4 minutes later, followed shortly by 2 Aurors who introduced themselves as Shacklebolt and Tonks, the latter of whom tripped over the edge of the carpet and caught herself with the automatic ease of someone who tripped over things regularly and had developed excellent reflexes as a consequence. Shacklebolt was large and very calm, the calm of someone who'd seen most things and had a framework for all of them. He looked at the bound figure, at Harry, at the wand Harry was still holding. "Nice incarcerus," he said. "Thank you," Harry said. "Any idea who they work for?" "I have a working theory," Harry said. "I prefer to keep it to myself until I have documentation rather than speculation." Shacklebolt looked at him with dark, steady eyes. "You're 10. 11, Harry said. "As of July." A pause. "The theory still needs documentation." Shacklebolt looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was looking at Harry with that complicated expression that had everything in it at once. "He's correct," Dumbledore said quietly. "Let him work through it properly." They took the attacker away. McGonagall walked Harry back to Gryffindor Tower herself, which was notable because she'd never done that before, and at the portrait hole she said, "Tell Weasley and Granger tonight, if you want to. Don't tell anyone else until we know more." "You think they should know," Harry said. "I think," she said, "that you've built something worth protecting, and the people in it should know when it's under pressure." She met his eyes. "Your mother used to say that the strongest structures are the ones where all the joints know what load they're carrying." She said it with the practiced neutrality of someone delivering something they've been saving for the right moment. "Go to bed. Eat something first." He went in. The common room was warm and full of the late evening hum of students winding down. Ron and Hermione were at their usual table, and they looked up when he came in, and his face must have said something because Hermione immediately closed her book and Ron sat up straighter and said, very quietly, "What happened?" Harry sat down. "There was an incident," he said. "Two people. In the corridor outside Flitwick's office. One stunned, one ran. The Aurors have the stunned one." Ron and Hermione were both very still. "You're not hurt," Hermione said. It was not quite a question. "No. They tried to. What did they try to do?" "Incapacitate me, at minimum," Harry said. "The first spell was a hex rather than something directly harmful, which suggests the brief was probably to take me somewhere rather than hurt me here." Ron's jaw was tight. "Malfoy. That's my working theory," Harry said. "But I want documentation. The Aurors have the attacker, Shacklebolt's good, from what I've seen. He'll find the connection if it's there." They were quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Crookshanks had appeared from somewhere and deposited himself on Hermione's feet with the authority of a cat who has decided where he's going to be. "The framework we sent to the Wizengamot," Ron said slowly. "If it went out Tuesday and today's Wednesday, Malfoy may have received intelligence about it before it was officially filed," Hermione said. "Or he anticipated it," Harry said. "He's smart enough to have anticipated it. So he moved before the framework could be formally acknowledged," Hermione said. "Before the 10 undecided members had a chance to read it. Which is a very short window," Harry said. "Which means he either already had this planned or he moves very fast when he needs to." "Both," Ron said, "probably." Harry looked at the fire. "Shacklebolt," he said. "He's in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Which is under the joint governance structure." He paused. "He's technically an employee of a department I have partial oversight of." "Don't," Hermione said, immediately and precisely. He looked at her. "Don't use the governance authority to direct the investigation," she said. "Even if you legally can. It compromises the independence of the finding and gives Malfoy an argument that the investigation was controlled by the subject of it." Harry looked at her for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said. Not arrogantly, factually. "Let Shacklebolt work independently. If he finds the Malfoy connection, it means more coming from him than from any channel you control." "When did you get this good at institutional strategy?" Ron asked her. "I've been reading Harry's governance documents," she said. "They're actually quite interesting once you get past the first 30 pages of jurisdictional definitions." Harry found, despite everything, that he was smiling. It was small but real, and it was the specific kind of smile that comes from being exactly where you are, with exactly the people around you, rather than wishing for some other configuration. "We should also talk about Quirrell," he said. "Tonight?" Ron asked. "Tomorrow," Harry said. "Tonight I need to sleep. But tomorrow, the curriculum inspector is visiting next week. We need to make sure Neville and I have documented everything we've observed in defense classes, and that it's specific and dated and not just impressionistic." "I've already started that document," Hermione said. "It's in my notes under defense, observed irregularities. I've been keeping it since week 2. Of course she had. "One more thing," Harry said. "The Malfoy letter. The legal challenge. Now that the attack has happened, the timeline changes. If the challenge is filed and simultaneously there's a connected attack on me, the Wisengamot undecided members need to know about that connection before they vote. That's not political manipulation, it's relevant information about the nature of the opposition. Ron and Hermione both looked at him. You're going to tell the 10 undecided members that someone tried to grab you, Ron said. I'm going to make sure they have all the relevant information, Harry said. Including the timing. They can draw their own conclusions. They will draw their own conclusions, Hermione said. Yes, Harry said. People usually do when you give them accurate information and enough respect to think for themselves. The following week moved with the particular accelerating quality of things that have reached a tipping point. The curriculum inspector arrived, a small, brisk witch named Marchbanks who had the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had been evaluating educational institutions for longer than most of the institutions had existed, and sat in the back of Quirrell's defense class on a Thursday with a clipboard and an expression that gave nothing away. Quirrell's lesson that day was, for the first time, not bad. It was still theoretical, no practical component, but the theory was presented with a coherence it didn't normally have, the stammering reduced, the structure clearer. He knew he was being evaluated and had clearly prepared. Marchbanks said nothing during the class. Made notes. Left at the bell. In the corridor after, Ron said, he was better today. Yes, Harry said. So does the review find him adequate? The review isn't based on one class, Hermione said. Marchbanks will look at lesson plans, assessment records, student progress documentation, previous class observations if there are any on file. She paused. She'll also talk to students. Harry had anticipated this. The previous evening he'd sat with Hermione and Ron and Neville and worked through what each of them had genuinely observed, not coached, not shaped, just helped each of them articulate the specific things they'd noticed in their own words. Because Marchbanks was sharp enough to tell the difference between students who'd been prompted and students who were reporting their own experience, and the latter was what mattered. Marchbanks knocked on the Gryffindor common room portrait the following morning and asked to speak with first-year students about their defense experience. She spoke to 6 of them. Harry was third. She asked him, precisely and without leading, what he had and hadn't found useful in defense classes so far. He told her what was true, that the theoretical content was generally accurate, that the structure of lessons was inconsistent, that the practical component was insufficient for a subject where practical ability was the actual assessed outcome, and that on 2 occasions the instructor had been visibly distressed in a way that affected the conduct of the lesson. He did not mention the turban. He did not mention Voldemort. He reported what he'd directly observed as a student. Marchbanks wrote it down. She looked at him when she'd finished with the particular expression of someone who has just understood something they already knew. You submitted the curriculum review request, she said. Yes, Harry said. Why? Because a deficiency was there, he said. And the governance structure exists to identify and address deficiencies. That's what it's for. And the personal dimension, she said. You're not simply a governance stakeholder in this situation. You're also a student. The defense curriculum you're identifying as deficient is the one you're receiving. That's not a conflict of interest, Harry said. That's direct experience of the problem. Marchbanks looked at him for a long moment. Then she wrote something else down, closed her notebook, and said, the review will reach its formal conclusion in 3 weeks. The findings will go to the board and to Headmaster Dumbledore. Any remediation recommendations will be implemented in the spring term at the latest. She stood. Thank you, Mr. Potter. She left. Neville, sitting in the chair across from where Harry had been, exhaled. That was, she's thorough. Good, Harry said. Thorough is what we need. The message from Shacklebolt arrived that Friday. It wasn't a formal letter. It came via Dumbledore, passed on with a note in Dumbledore's handwriting that said only, the investigation has produced a finding you should be aware of. The full documentation is with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Shacklebolt has asked that I convey the following. The following, in Shacklebolt's own handwriting, clipped, precise, professional, read, the individual apprehended in the Hogwarts corridor Wednesday has been identified as a private security consultant with documented ties to 3 previous Malfoy family legal matters. He is not an employee of any ministry department. The spell used in the approach matches a proprietary modified variant documented in only one previous case, which was associated with a private magical security firm contracted to Malfoy Manor as recently as July of this year. This constitutes a documented connection rather than a proven chain of command, and formal proceedings will require additional evidence. However, I thought it relevant to inform you that the documented connection exists and has been established through independent investigation. Kingsley Shacklebolt, Senior Auror. Harry read it 3 times. Then he sent 2 copies, one to Lavinia Blight, one to the Wisingamot secretary, both with Shacklebolt's documented language quoted precisely and a note that this was not an allegation but a finding of documented connection requiring the Wisingamot's awareness given the simultaneous pending legal challenge. He also sent a single line to Lucius Malfoy. The documentation that connects your private security consultant to the attack in Hogwarts corridor has been shared with the Wisingamot secretary and the press. I thought you should know. No threat. No demand. Just information, offered with the same directness Harry brought to everything. He sent it and went to dinner. Ron and Hermione were already at the table. Ron had a copy of the Quidditch schedule and was explaining something about the upcoming first-year flying assessments with more enthusiasm than the topic technically required, and Hermione was listening with the fond, faintly exasperated expression she'd developed for Ron's Quidditch opinions. And Neville was eating steadily and occasionally contributing to the flying conversation in a way that had become more confident over the past several weeks. Harry sat down. He filled his plate. He listened to the Quidditch conversation and contributed a thought about broom handling in crosswinds that redirected the discussion for several minutes in a direction Ron found extremely interesting. Outside, the magical world continued its adjustment, the audit bleeding through institutions, the Malfoy challenge preparing itself, the 10 undecided Wisingamot members receiving their second letter of the week from an 11-year-old who had sent them documented information without comment and trusted them to draw conclusions. Inside Hogwarts, in a classroom on the 3rd floor that Harry had started visiting more often in the evenings, the stone sat behind its protections, patient and chemical and old, doing the work of existing without particularly caring about any of the things happening around it. And somewhere in the castle, Professor Quirrell paced his office with something that wasn't quite him at all, feeling the net drawing in and calculating, with the cold patience of something ancient and furious and very nearly out of time. Chapter 6, The Lord of the Feast. The Wisingamot voted on a Tuesday. Harry knew before the owls arrived because Hermione had been tracking the alignments with the focused patience of someone running a very complicated mathematical proof, updating her notebook every time a new public statement appeared or a reliable source shifted position. By Monday evening she'd counted 73 votes likely in favor of acknowledging the framework, 41 likely against, and 36 still genuinely uncertain, which meant the framework didn't pass cleanly but the Malfoy challenge didn't either, which was the outcome Harry had actually been working toward. Not a decisive vote. A managed stalemate, which meant the challenge was neutralized without becoming a battle that anyone definitively lost, and the framework went forward for further legislative discussion rather than being adopted wholesale or rejected entirely. It was the kind of outcome that looked like compromise and functioned like progress, and it was exactly what Augusta Longbottom's letter had warned him about. The previous 3 reform attempts had each sought decisive victory, and decisive victories in the Wisingamot required a coalition nobody had managed to hold together long enough. He wasn't trying to hold a coalition together. He was trying to make the right answer the easy answer, and then let people choose it. 73-41, Ron said at breakfast, looking at the official record that had arrived with the morning owls. With 36 abstaining. The abstentions are the win, Harry said. Ron looked at him. The Malfoy challenge needed a majority to proceed formally, Hermione said, not looking up from her own copy. It got 41 votes out of 150. That's not a majority. The challenge is dead. She turned a page. The framework goes to the legislative committee for review, which is where new laws go. That's the correct process. So we didn't win, Ron said, but Malfoy lost. We moved the thing forward, Harry said. That's not the same as winning. But it's more durable. Ron thought about this for a moment, working through it the way he worked through chess problems, not rushing to the conclusion, actually mapping the positions. Malfoy's going to try something else, he said. Yes, Harry said. He will. And we don't know what. We know it'll be different to this, Harry said. He's smart enough not to use the same approach twice. He said it with the calm certainty that had become his default mode for discussing Lucius Malfoy, because it was true and because the alternative, letting the uncertainty become anxiety, was not useful. Malfoy was a problem to be managed, not feared. The distinction mattered. What Harry hadn't told Ron yet, hadn't told anyone, had been sitting with for 3 days, was that the thing he was most worried about wasn't Lucius Malfoy. It was the corridor outside the 3rd floor. He'd been going there at night. Not to the room itself, he'd tested the locked door twice and understood it was protected by more than a lock, but to the corridor. Standing near the entrance and paying attention, the way you pay attention to something you can't see directly but can feel the outline of through other things. Temperature. Sound. The particular quality of the magic in the walls nearby, which was thicker than it should be for an ordinary corridor. 3 evenings in the past fortnight something had come from behind that door and moved within it. He couldn't see it, the 3-headed dog, he was fairly sure, the massive warm breath and footstep sounds that came through the door when he pressed his ear carefully to the gap, but he could hear something else underneath the dog. A trapdoor, he thought. And below that, something descending, layer by layer, the specific architectural logic of a space that had been designed to be difficult rather than impossible. Designed to be difficult rather than impossible was interesting. If you wanted something truly secure, you made it impossible to reach. If you wanted something difficult, you wanted someone to be able to get through, just not easily, and not without revealing themselves in the process. Which meant the protections were also a kind of trap. He'd taken that thought to Dumbledore in their most recent meeting, and Dumbledore had been quiet for a moment before saying, "You're not wrong about the design philosophy," which was as close to direct confirmation as Dumbledore usually got. "You want Voldemort to try," Harry had said. "I want to know the full extent of what remains of him when he does," Dumbledore had said, which was different and more complicated, and Harry had spent several days understanding the distinction. Tonight he wasn't standing in the corridor. Tonight he was sitting in the empty second-floor classroom where he'd been practicing every evening, running through spells with the methodical focus that had become as habitual as breathing, because the attack in the corridor had clarified something. He wasn't just preparing in the abstract. He was preparing for something specific, on a timeline he didn't fully control. The classroom was dim, lit by the lamp he'd brought, and the targets he'd set up across the room were various: a stack of books for precision, a suspended gobstone for moving targets, a piece of chalk he'd transfigured into something that fought back, which had been an interesting challenge for 2 weeks now and was getting less challenging, which meant he needed harder things to practice against. He was mid-sequence, Protego into Expelliarmus into Stupefy, the 3-spell combination he'd been working on until it was as natural as breathing, when the door opened. He had his wand up and pointed before the figure was fully through the door, and Draco Malfoy stopped with his hands slightly raised and a look on his face that had respect and alarm in roughly equal measure. "It's me," Draco said. Harry lowered his wand. "How did you find this room?" "I followed you," Draco said, and said it with the directness of someone who decided that honesty was more efficient than explanation. 3 nights ago. I didn't come in then, I wanted to think first." "About what?" Draco came the rest of the way through the door and closed it behind him. He was in pajamas and a robe, which gave him an oddly undefended quality compared to his usual precise presentation. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at the targets and the lamp and Harry in the way of someone cataloging a scene before responding to it. "My father wrote me," he said. "After the Wisengamot vote." "What did he say?" "He said the framework vote was a minor setback and the actual work was proceeding on a different front." Draco was very still. He didn't say what front. He never gives me operational information, he thinks I'm too young to be trusted with it. The corners of his mouth moved in something that wasn't quite bitterness but was adjacent to it. He's right, technically. I've proven that tonight. Harry looked at him. You're here because the letter worried you. I'm here because he said the actual work, Draco said. Not the next step or the next challenge. The actual work. Which means what he's been doing publicly has been the performance. The thing he actually wants is something else. I know, Harry said. Draco blinked. You know. I don't know the specific mechanism. But the legal challenge was always a distraction, it required too much public coordination to be a primary strategy for someone as careful as your father. The real move is something quieter. Harry set his wand down on the nearest desk. Sit down. Draco sat, with the automatic good posture of someone whose entire childhood had enforced it. He looked at Harry with those gray eyes and said, "What are you going to do?" "Work it out," Harry said. "And then do something about it." "You're not afraid of him," Draco said. It wasn't an accusation. It was more like someone describing a phenomenon they don't quite have a category for. "I think he's dangerous," Harry said. "I'm not afraid of dangerous things. I'm careful about them." He looked at Draco steadily. "Why are you here, specifically? Not the letter, not the worry, why this room, tonight?" Draco's jaw moved once. "Because whatever he's planning, it involves the school." He mentioned Dumbledore by name, not directly, but in the context of obstacles that are managing themselves. Which means something is happening inside Hogwarts that he thinks is going in his favor. He paused. "I don't want it to." The two of them looked at each other across the dim classroom. "Quarrel," Harry said. Something in Draco's face changed, not surprise, exactly, but the specific look of a piece falling into a picture that had been missing it. The defense professor. He's being used by someone. I'm not going to explain the full detail tonight, but the curriculum inspector's review is going to result in his removal before Christmas. And before that happens, the person using him is going to make a move. Harry was watching Draco carefully. "Does your father know about the third-floor corridor?" A pause that answered the question before the words did. "He knows there's something there that Dumbledore is protecting," Draco said. "He's mentioned Dumbledore's obsession with a particular alchemist. An old one. Flammel. He didn't say the name. But yes, probably." Harry was quiet for a moment. This was, more information than he'd had. And the picture it made was becoming clearer. Lucius knew about the stone, or close enough. And if he knew, and if Voldemort was here using Quirrell, then the two objectives, Malfoy's agenda and Voldemort's survival, were at least parallel if not cooperative. Two different entities wanting the same access point, possibly for different reasons. "I need you to do something for me," Harry said. "And I need you to understand that if you do it, you can't undo it. Not because I'd hold it against you, but because you'll know you did it, and that'll matter." Draco looked at him. "What?" "Write to your father. Tell him you've seen nothing unusual at school. Tell him the first years are boring and the food is adequate and nothing of interest is happening. Make it sound exactly like every other letter from a Slytherin first year." Harry met Draco's eyes. "And if he asks you to do anything specific, tell me first. Before you do it or don't." Draco was very still. You're asking me to inform on my father. I'm asking you to tell me if he asks you to do something that crosses a line you've already drawn." Harry's voice was even. "You drew the line the day you got on the train and sat in my compartment. I'm not asking you to redraw it. Just to hold it." The silence in the room was long enough to be real. "He's my father," Draco said. Not defensively, just naming the weight of it. "I know," Harry said. "My father is dead because of the person your father works with." He said it without heat, without making it an attack. I'm not asking you to stop loving him. I'm asking you to make a decision about what you're willing to do. Draco looked at the floor. Then the wall. Then back at Harry, with an expression that had nothing performed about it. It was just a 10-year-old boy working out the shape of his own moral compass in real time and finding the process harder and more necessary than he'd expected. "All right," he said. "All right," Harry said, and picked his wand back up. "Go to bed. Write a boring letter home tomorrow." Draco stood, went to the door. Paused. "Potter. The 3-spell combination you were running. Protego into Expelliarmus into Stupefy." "Yes. The timing gap between the first and second," Draco said. "You're leaving it too long. The shield hasn't fully dropped by the time the disarming spell fires and it's clipping the edge. That's why the disarming spell isn't going quite straight." Harry looked at him. "How do you know that?" "My father hired a private dueling instructor," Draco said. "I've been training since I was 6. He said it without pride, neutrally, like it was information rather than a boast. "The gap between shield and the next offensive cast should be under half a second. You're running about 3/4. He left. The door closed. Harry stood in the dim room for a moment. Then he went back to his targets and ran the sequence again, tightening the gap between shield and cast, and felt the difference immediately. The disarming spell went clean and straight and hit the suspended gob's tone with a crisp precision it hadn't had before. He practiced until midnight. 3 things happened in the week before the Christmas feast. The first was that the Marchbanks Review concluded and its findings were distributed to the Joint Oversight Board, Dumbledore, and the relevant ministry committee simultaneously. The language was formal and measured and absolutely clear. The defense against the dark arts program at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry had been operating below minimum curriculum standards for 6 consecutive years, with particular deficiencies in practical instruction. The current instructor's performance was rated as insufficient to meet remediation targets within the current academic year. A replacement was recommended for the spring term. The finding didn't name Quirrell as dangerous. It didn't need to. It named him as inadequate, which was both true and documented and sufficient for the institutional process to remove him on legitimate grounds without requiring anyone to explain the actual reason. Quirrell was informed. Harry didn't witness that conversation, but he heard from Neville, who'd overheard it through the defense classroom door while returning a textbook, that the conversation had lasted 11 minutes and that Quirrell's voice during it had had 2 distinct qualities that alternated in a way that suggested 2 different speakers. The second thing was that Shacklebolt made an arrest. Not Lucius Malfoy. The documented connection wasn't sufficient for that yet, and Harry knew it and hadn't pushed for it. What Shacklebolt arrested was the private security firm's records officer, who turned out to have documentation of 9 separate contracted operations over the past 2 years, 3 of which had ministry officials as named subjects. That information went to the Joint Oversight Board and the Wisengamot simultaneously, and it made the Malfoy legal challenge look even more precisely like what it was. Lucius Malfoy made no public statement. His silence was more interesting than anything he could have said. The third thing was the letter from Sirius Black. It arrived at breakfast on the Thursday before Christmas, via a tatty owl that looked like it had been flying for several days and was deeply done with the whole enterprise. The letter was written on what appeared to be the back of an official document, the official text scratched through, and the handwriting was large and slightly unsteady in the way of someone writing quickly and by poor light. "Harry, I don't know if this gets to you. I'm writing it anyway because someone I trust told me to, and I've learned that people I trust don't usually lead me wrong. My name is Sirius Black. I'm your godfather. I know what that sounds like from someone in my position. I know what the papers said. I want you to know I didn't do what they said I did, and I know you have no reason to believe that and no way to verify it yet, but the review the Gringotts board opened on my case is going to find evidence that was not admitted at my non-trial because there was no trial to admit it at. I've been in Azkaban for 10 years. I'm not going to describe it. I'll just say I've had a lot of time to think about your parents and about what happened that night and about the choices that led to where I am, and that when I found out what you've been doing this summer I cried, which was embarrassing but also the first thing that felt real in a very long time. Your father would have found the whole ministry thing absolutely magnificent and also slightly alarming. Your mother would have found it precisely correct. I know who the real traitor was. When the review board gets to the right files, they'll find it too. I don't ask you to take my word for it. I just ask that the review runs its full course. Yours, Sirius P.S. I've been told you named a barn owl bureaucrat. That is the most Potter thing I've heard in a decade, and it made me laugh for the first time since 1981. Harry read the letter. He read it again. He set it face down on the table and ate his breakfast and was aware of Ron and Hermione watching him with the careful attention of people who've learned when not to ask. After breakfast, in the corridor, he said, "The review of Black's case. Where is it?" Hermione answered immediately, because she'd been tracking it. The Gringotts Review Board requested the original Auror case files in October. The Ministry produced partial files in November. Gringotts requested the remaining files formally in the first week of December. No response yet. The remaining files, Harry said. What's in them? I don't know specifically, she said. But the fact that the Ministry produced partial files and then stopped suggests there's something in the unreleased portion they'd prefer to manage carefully. Or someone, Ron said quietly. Harry looked at Bureaucrat, who had delivered the letter and was now sitting on the Ollery windowsill looking deeply relieved to be stationary. He said, "I'm going to write to the review board and formally request that the Ministry be given a 14-day deadline for full file production, after which Gringotts exercises its authority to subpoena them directly through the Joint Governance Clause in the Law Enforcement Oversight Agreement." He said it the same way he said everything, directly, without drama, in the voice of someone who'd looked at the options and chosen the most useful one. But underneath it was something else, something that wasn't strategy, the image of a man in Azkaban writing on the back of a scratched-through document by poor light, and the particular sentence, the first thing that felt real in a very long time. He wrote the letter. He sent it. And then he folded Sirius's letter carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his robes, where it sat against his chest for the rest of the day like something warm. The Christmas feast was on the last evening before the holiday. Most students had gone home, the Weasley twins had stayed, which meant the remaining Gryffindors had spent 2 days navigating an ongoing low-level experiment in seasonal goodwill that involved more sparks and strange smells than was strictly festive. Harry had stayed. Ron had stayed. Hermione had gone home for the holiday but pressed Harry's hand firmly before she left and said, "Write to me if anything happens," in the tone that meant she expected him to actually do it. Neville had stayed too, which surprised Harry until Neville explained that his grandmother was visiting a relative in France and the house would be empty until the 27th. He said it with practiced lightness that Harry recognized as the kind of practiced lightness that covers something lonelier than it was advertising. "Come to dinner with us," Harry said. All the dinners. All of them. Neville had gone pink but not declined. The Great Hall for the Christmas feast was extraordinary in the way that the Great Hall handled most things, completely, without half-measures. 12 Christmas trees, actual snow on the ceiling, tables reduced to one long one running down the center where the remaining students and several professors sat with the specific warmth of a small gathering in a space designed for hundreds. Harry sat between Ron and Neville. Dumbledore was at the head of the table, wearing robes of a particularly festive blue and looking genuinely content in the way of someone who finds large empty spaces less comfortable than small full ones. McGonagall was next to him, wearing the expression of someone who had allowed themselves one glass of something and was managing it gracefully. Flitwick was telling a story about a charms conference in the 70s that kept getting interrupted by his own laughter. Quirrell was not present. He'd been absent from the staff table for 3 days, his removal process now in its formal administrative phase. Nobody had officially explained where he was. Harry ate his Christmas dinner and watched the table. The food was extraordinary, every dish present in the particular abundance of Hogwarts at its best, appearing and replenishing with the quiet competence of a kitchen that had been doing this for centuries. He had turkey and roast potatoes and something with chestnuts that he'd never had before and was immediately planning to have again, and Ron beside him was conducting what appeared to be a one-sided competition with himself about how much perfectly golden stuffing one person could consume without external judgment. Halfway through the meal Dumbledore caught Harry's eye from down the table and raised his glass. Not a toast, just an acknowledgement. Harry raised his water glass back. They'd had 4 meetings since the first one. Each had been different, less formal, more direct, the calibration between them still in process but moving towards something that was neither the relationship Dumbledore had planned nor the confrontation Harry had initially anticipated, but something third and more genuine than either. Dumbledore had answered more questions than Harry expected. Harry had offered more consideration than Dumbledore expected. They were, slowly, learning to be honest with each other, which was harder than it sounded and more necessary than almost anything else. After dinner, after the crackers and the terrible jokes and the paper crowns that Ron wore with complete commitment and Neville wore with charmed surprise, after the plates cleared themselves and the hall settled into the warm after-dinner hum of people not wanting to move yet, Harry went to find Dumbledore. He was at the far end of the hall by the window that looked toward the grounds, the snow coming down outside in the quiet, persistent way of Scottish December. He had a small glass of something amber and was looking at the grounds with the expression Harry had come to understand meant he was thinking about something old. "The stone," Harry said, standing next to him. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "He's going to try tonight," Harry said. "Or very soon. Quirrell knows the review finding. He knows removal is coming. Whatever they're planning, the timeline has been compressed." Dumbledore looked at him steadily. "I had the same thought." "You have a plan," Harry said. "I have a disposition," Dumbledore said, which was characteristically precise. "There are protections on the stone that I believe Voldemort cannot pass without a living hand. The Mirror of Erist, the final protection, shows only the person who wants the stone but not to use it. Voldemort cannot see himself holding it without wanting to use it." Harry thought about this. So the design of the trap is that the last protection can only be passed by someone who doesn't want what's behind it. Essentially. "That's elegant," Harry said, and meant it. "Thank you," Dumbledore said, with a small smile that was entirely genuine. "It was your mother's design, actually. She contributed several of the protection concepts. She was, as McGonagall has probably told you, an exceptional witch." Harry said nothing for a moment. Outside the snow fell steadily. "If Quirrell makes a move tonight," Harry said, "I want to be there." "Harry, not to fight him alone," Harry said, steadily. "Not to be a hero. I want to be there because I understand what Voldemort is and what he wants and I have information that's relevant to the encounter, and because I am better prepared than any other student in this school and probably better prepared than you think." He looked at Dumbledore directly. "I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you my intention. You can choose how to respond to that." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The blue eyes were complicated, pride and worry and something else, something Harry identified slowly as the particular feeling of someone who has been planning around a thing for a decade and is now watching the thing become a person. "I'll be unavailable tonight," Dumbledore said carefully. "An urgent matter in London. I expect I'll be back before morning." "But if something were to happen while you were away," Harry said. "The staff on duty are Professors Snape and Flitwick," Dumbledore said. "Both capable. Both aware of aspects of the situation." He paused. "I would not want a student to feel they needed to act alone." "I won't be alone," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. "No," he said, quietly. "I don't suppose you will." He found Ron and Neville in the common room and told them. Completely, directly, without softening the details or protecting them from the scope of it. Voldemort. The stone. Quirrell. Tonight or very soon. What needed to happen and what the risks were. He'd learned this over the past months, that the people around you cannot make real decisions without real information, and that protecting them from the weight of a situation by withholding it is not protection, it's just a lonelier kind of difficulty. Ron listened with the focus he brought to chess problems, mapping positions. When Harry finished, Ron was quiet for a moment and then said, "Right. What's the play?" "We go to the third-floor corridor," Harry said. "Through whatever protections are there. We reach the stone before Quirrell does, or intercept him at the mirror. And we prevent Voldemort from using it." "How?" Neville said. He was pale but steady, the particular steadiness Harry had been watching develop since September, the courage that didn't announce itself. "Voldemort is using Quirrell as a host," Harry said. "He can't exist without a living body. If Quirrell is incapacitated, Voldemort is without a means of acting. We don't need to destroy Voldemort tonight, we need to prevent him from getting the stone." He looked at both of them. "This is not a requirement. I need you to understand that. I'll go alone if you want to stay." Ron looked at Neville. Neville looked at Ron. "Don't be an idiot," Ron said. Neville just nodded, once, with the certainty of someone who'd already made the decision and was ready to move. They went at 11. The corridor was empty. The locked door opened, to Harry's moderate surprise, without difficulty, the lock recognizing something in him that he suspected had to do with the Peverell title and its specific magical inheritance, though he filed that for later examination. The three-headed dog, enormous, warm, loud as machinery, was already asleep. The harp was still playing. Someone had been here before them. They went down through the trapdoor, through the devil's snare that Hermione would have solved in 30 seconds and that Ron solved in 25 by remembering from herbology that it hated light and producing a focused lumos that filled the chamber. Through the winged keys, Harry on a broom, chasing the ancient silver one with the bent wing, catching it on the third pass with the same clean certainty that had caught Neville's Remembrall months ago. Through the troll, already unconscious, knocked out by someone moving ahead of them, which meant Quirrell had a head start that was longer than Harry wanted. The chess game stopped them. It was Ron who understood it, immediately and completely, who stood at the edge of the giant board and saw the whole thing in his head and said, "I need to play," with the quiet certainty of someone who knows what they're good at and isn't going to pretend otherwise. He played it masterfully. Not quickly, carefully, with the patience of someone playing a game that mattered, sacrificing pieces with the cool strategic clarity of someone who understood that losing pieces wasn't losing the game. Harry watched him and felt something that was not quite awe but was close, the specific respect of recognizing someone operating at the full height of what they could do. When the White King toppled and the pieces cleared the path, Ron was bleeding from a cut on his forehead where a chess piece had struck him. "I'm fine," he said, before either Harry or Neville could speak. "Go. Both of you." "Ron," Neville started. "I'll get Snape or Flitwick," Ron said, with complete practicality. "They know aspects of it. I'll bring backup. You go." He met Harry's eyes. "Go, Harry." Harry went. Neville went with him, without discussion. Through the potions riddle, 7 bottles, a logic puzzle built on elimination rather than magic, which took Harry 4 minutes to solve cleanly and which Neville read over his shoulder and confirmed from a different approach, which was the right way to solve things. They drank. Through the final door. The chamber beyond was dominated by the mirror. It was exactly as Dumbledore had described, tall and ornate, the inscription running across the top in letters that shimmered when Harry looked at them directly. Erist stra eru oit ube kafru oit onwosi. I show not your face but your heart's desire. Quirrell was already there. He was standing in front of the mirror with his wand out and his hands shaking, and he wasn't looking at the reflection that Harry was fairly sure showed him giving a Dark Lord a body, he was looking at the surface with the frustrated desperation of someone who can see the answer but can't reach it. "Potter," Quirrell said. His voice had the double quality that Neville had described, 2 registers, one uncertain and one beneath it, cold and certain and nothing like Quirrell. "The boy who bought the ministry. The boy who meddled." "I didn't meddle," Harry said pleasantly, stepping into the room with his wand out and his weight balanced the way Draco had been teaching him, indirectly, through the corrections he'd been making. "I managed assets. There's a difference. The other voice, the cold one, underneath, said, "Quirrell. Turn around." Quirrell turned. "You don't fear me," Voldemort said, and there was something almost curious in the cold voice, the genuine surprise of something that had not been surprised in a long time. "How interesting. I've been thinking about you since July," Harry said. "I've had 4 months to be afraid. I used the time for something more useful. Let me see the boy." The turban unwound. It moved on its own, or Quirrell moved it, and then the back of Quirrell's head was visible, and in it, a face. White and snake-like and ancient in the specific way of something that had chosen its own age, that had decided it would not be subject to time and had paid prices for that decision that had made it into something no longer precisely human. The eyes, red and slitted, fixed on Harry. "The scar," Voldemort said softly. "I gave you that. We have a connection, you and I." "We have a prophecy," Harry said. "That's different." "You know about the prophecy." "Not a question." "I know about the prophecy, I know about the Horcruxes." He felt Quirrell's whole body flinch at the word, and Voldemort's face tightened. "I know about your original body's deterioration and the need for a restorative. I know about the stone. I've had 4 months. Harry held the red eyes steadily. "I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to prevent you getting the stone." "And how do you propose to do that?" "By getting it first," Harry said, and stepped toward the mirror. Quirrell moved, fast, a hex that Harry sidestepped without quite thinking about it, the body learning before the mind, Draco's correction working in real time, and Neville, from the doorway, hit Quirrell with a stupefy that connected solidly in the back and sent him stumbling. Not down, Voldemort's will was holding the body upright through sheer force, but stumbling. Harry looked into the mirror. He saw himself. Not reaching for anything, not holding anything, not standing in a ministry conference room or a Gringotts office or anywhere significant. Just, himself, standing with Ron on one side and Hermione on the other and a man with a scarred, thin face and grey eyes who had his father's jaw, laughing at something. The man was serious, he understood, without being told. Just himself, with the people he'd chosen, and the family that was possible. He felt something slip into his pocket. The stone. Real and smooth and warm. He turned. Quirrell was 3 feet away, Voldemort's face contorted with fury, the red eyes wild with the specific frustration of something ancient and powerful being denied by something young and unreasonable. "Give it to me," Voldemort said. "No," Harry said. Quirrell lunged. His hand closed on Harry's wrist. What happened then, Harry would spend years trying to explain properly. The contact was, agony was the word, but the word didn't quite cover it, because it was also something else, a wrongness that had a direction, like the touch itself knew it was wrong and was recoiling from its own existence. Quirrell screamed. The hand on Harry's wrist was blistering, the skin cracking and darkening, and the face on the back of the head was screaming too, a sound without sound, something departing. Harry held on. Not to hurt Quirrell. To keep the contact, because every second of contact was another second Voldemort couldn't direct a focused attack, another second Neville had to get to the door and bring whoever was coming, another second the stone stayed in Harry's pocket. He held on until Quirrell dropped. The room went very quiet. The face on the back of the head was gone, not there, gone, the skin of the scalp just skin now. Quirrell on the floor was breathing, barely, but the thing that had been using him had departed in a cold rush that Harry felt as a temperature drop and a sound like wind and then nothing. Harry stood in the chamber with his wrist burned and his wand still in his hand and the stone in his pocket. Neville was in the doorway. He'd seen most of it. He was pale and breathing fast but he was there, and his wand was up, and his eyes were steady. "Ron," Harry said. "Ron went to get Snape," Neville said. "He's coming." "Good," Harry said, and sat down on the floor because his legs had decided they'd earned it. Neville came and sat next to him, the way Harry had sat next to Hermione in the back of Flourish and Blotts 5 months ago. Not close enough to crowd. Not far enough to be distant. Just, there. They waited. Snape arrived first, wand out, taking in the room in one practiced sweep, Quirrell on the floor, Harry on the floor, Neville beside him, the mirror dark and still. Something complex moved across Snape's face, a rapid series of calculations, and at the end of them he looked at Harry with those dark eyes and said, "The stone." "My pocket," Harry said. "Are you injured?" "My wrist." "Contact with Quirrell, the burning effect." "I'll need the hospital wing." Snape crossed the room in 4 strides, checked Quirrell with a diagnostic spell, checked Harry's wrist with a different one, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Voldemort." "Gone," Harry said. "For now. Not permanently. He's without a body again." He held Snape's eyes. "This isn't over. I want you to know I know that." Snape looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know you know." Dumbledore arrived 4 minutes after Snape, which meant he hadn't been in London or hadn't been as unavailable as he'd indicated, and Harry appreciated the honesty of that without feeling deceived by it, because he understood now how Dumbledore operated, the specific way that love and calculation lived together in the same person and weren't contradictions. He looked at Harry on the floor and his face did something complicated and real. "The stone," Harry said, and reached into his pocket and put it in Dumbledore's hand. "Keep it, destroy it, give it back to Flamel, that's your decision. I just needed it not to be Voldemort's." "Harry," Dumbledore said, and his voice had something in it that was just, the name, just that. Not the title or the legend or the governance stakeholder. The person. "I'm fine," Harry said. "My wrist hurts. Ron's somewhere above us losing his mind about something." Neville was extraordinary. He glanced at Neville, who had gone slightly pink but held still. "Can someone send a message to Hermione? She's going to know something happened and the not knowing will be worse than the knowing." Someone went to get Ron. Someone, Dumbledore, it turned out, conjured a stretcher for Quirrell, who was alive but not conscious and not going to be conscious for some time. Snape wrapped Harry's wrist with professional efficiency that nonetheless hurt significantly less than it would have expected to, and said nothing while doing it, which was its own kind of consideration. The walk back up through the chambers was slower than the walk down. Harry was tired in the specific way of someone who has been running on focused intensity for several hours and is now aware of how many ordinary resources that consumed. His wand hand was fine. His wrist was bandaged. He had no particular dramatic feelings about any of it. What he had, walking up through the chess room, the pieces put neatly to the sides by Snape's wand, Ron's blood still on the floor, which Harry made a mental note to go back and clean tomorrow when he could, was the same feeling he'd had in the leaky cauldron in July, after Fudge had signed the documents. The feeling of putting something down. Of arms stronger than expected from carrying something long enough. Ron was in the corridor above the trapdoor room, sitting against the wall with Flitwick beside him pressing a cloth to the cut on his forehead, and when Harry came through he said, "About time," with the shaky relief of someone who had been holding themselves together by force of will and could now let some of that will rest. Harry sat next to him, on the other side from Flitwick. "Good chess," he said. "Brilliant chess," Ron corrected, and the correction was fair. Madame Pomfrey kept Harry in the hospital wing for 2 nights, which he spent mostly reading and writing correspondence, because events had reached a point where the year's threads needed to be tied together and the people involved deserved direct communication rather than institutional summaries. He wrote to Shacklebolt, confirming that Quirrell had been working under Voldemort's influence, that Voldemort was not permanently gone, and that the files and evidence around Quirrell's movements over the past year were worth examining carefully for any connections to outside coordination. He wrote to Sharpblade, requesting that the Sirius Black case review be escalated to urgent status, and that the specific files the Ministry had failed to produce be formally subpoenaed under the Law Enforcement Governance Clause immediately. He wrote to Augusta Longbottom, a direct letter, not through Neville, thanking her for the information about previous reform attempts and telling her precisely what the year had produced so far, and asking her, if she was willing, to take a role in the framework's legislative development in the new year. He wrote to Draco, a brief note. It was Quirrell. It's over for now. Your information helped. Thank you. He wrote to Lavinia Blight, a full accounting of the events in the corridor below the third floor, for publication once Dumbledore had cleared it, with the specific request that the story focus on the institutional failures that had allowed Quirrell's appointment and continued presence rather than the dramatic elements of the encounter. And he wrote to Sirius Black. Longer than any of the others. The review is being escalated. The files that weren't produced are being subpoenaed. I don't know how long it takes, but it's moving and it won't stop. My father would have found the ministry thing alarming too, I think. Dumbledore says he had an excellent sense of when something was more serious than it looked. I'm glad the letter reached me. Write again when you can. Harry P.S. Bureaucrat is an excellent owl. He carried your letter from Azkaban without complaint and then slept for 14 hours straight, which I found both reasonable and admirable. He sealed the letters, gave them to Bureaucrat in batches across 2 days, and lay back on the hospital wing pillow and looked at the ceiling. Ron came to visit on the second day with a chessboard and bad hospital wing biscuits that he procured from somewhere, and they played 3 games, Harry losing 2 of them because Ron was genuinely better at chess than he was and Harry had no particular interest in pretending otherwise. Neville came with a book about herbology that he wanted to tell Harry about, and did, at length, with the growing confidence of someone who had realized that having things to say and saying them were not as separate activities as they'd previously seemed. Hermione came with a list. It was a long list. It was, specifically, a list of every development Harry had mentioned in his letters that she had follow-up questions about, organized by urgency and topic and annotated with her own research from the past week. She sat in the visitor's chair and went through it with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had been very worried and was processing that worry by converting it into actionable items. When she'd finished, she put the list down and looked at him with those brown eyes. You should have told me before you went, she said. Not angry. Just, the specific honesty of a person who means what they say. I know, Harry said. I'm sorry. I would have come back, she said. From home. I would have come back the same night if you'd written. I know, he said again. I didn't want to, don't protect me from things, she said, with the same directness she brought to everything. You don't need to protect me from things. That's not what I'm here for. Harry looked at her. Thought about the Leaky Cauldron bookshop in July, the girl in the corner who'd stopped crying because something more interesting had arrived. 5 months. An extraordinary amount had happened in 5 months. All right, he said. I won't. She picked up her list again. Right. Question 4. The Horcruxes. You mentioned them to Voldemort in the chamber. How many did you know about and how did you find out? That, Harry said, is going to be a long conversation. I've cleared the afternoon, she said. Dumbledore came on the morning of Harry's second day. He came alone, without the studied warmth he sometimes brought to formal encounters, just himself, tall and slightly tired around the eyes and genuinely present in the way Harry had come to understand was Dumbledore at his most honest. He sat in the visitor's chair and said, the stone is with Nicholas. He and Perenelle have decided to allow it to be destroyed. They're at peace with it. Good, Harry said. Voldemort is not gone, Dumbledore said. You know this. He's fled, a shade, disembodied, diminished further. He'll seek another host. It may be months, it may be years. He'll be looking for a way back. The Horcruxes, Harry said. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. You worked those out. The word made Quirrell flinch, Harry said. And the soul magic theory is in restricted section texts if you know what to look for. A wizard who split their soul to achieve immortality, the soul anchors them to life even when the body is destroyed. He can't die while they exist. He looked at Dumbledore. How many? I believe 7, Dumbledore said carefully. Although I have confirmed only a few. This is, Harry, this is the work of years, not months. I know, Harry said. I'm not suggesting we resolve it this summer. I'm suggesting we resolve it properly, with information and preparation rather than stumbling over them piece by piece. He met Dumbledore's eyes. I'd like to work on this together. Actually together, not you deciding what I need to know and giving it to me in pieces. Actually together. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. All right, he said finally, and the word had the weight of a real decision, not a managed concession. Actually together. Good, Harry said. Outside the hospital wing, Hogwarts was in its end-of-term mode, luggage being assembled, Owl's Post being finalized, the general organized departure of a school shutting down for winter. The snow was proper outside the windows, the grounds white and still, the black lake dark under the iron sky. A school year that had started with a 10-year-old in a Gringotts assessment room and a number so large it needed reading 3 times had arrived here, a hospital wing, a destroyed stone, a scattering of letters in transit across the country, a boy who was no longer whoever he'd been in July and wasn't yet whoever he was going to be, in the specific way that 11 is. He was not afraid of what came next. He was, if he was being precise about it, and he was always precise, when he could be, curious. The magical world was in a different shape than it had been in September. The ministry was in a different shape. The institutions around him were in the process of slowly becoming what they were supposed to be, not because anyone had fixed them overnight but because someone had started documenting the gap between what they were and what they claimed to be, and that documentation had a momentum of its own now. Sirius Black's case was moving. Voldemort was diminished and without a body and would be back, and when he was back Harry intended to be ready in ways he currently was not but had time to become. Lucius Malfoy was still out there, still patient, still planning. Draco Malfoy was making choices one at a time, without guarantee, which was the most honest kind of choosing. Ron was going to spend the holiday eating his mother's cooking and playing Quidditch in a snow-covered garden and being, Harry suspected, slightly unbearable about chess now that he'd beaten giant magical ones. Hermione was going to read 12 books she'd specifically identified as important and write notes that were organized by category and subcategory and probably annotated with a cross-referencing system that she'd designed during the train ride home. Neville was going to go back to a house that would be empty until the 27th, and his grandmother would come home from France and look at her grandson and possibly begin to see the person who had stood in a chamber under Hogwarts with his wand up, steady. Harry was going to stay at Hogwarts for the holiday. He had correspondence to manage and books to read and spells to practice in the empty second-floor classroom, and Dumbledore had said he was welcome at the small holiday table with whatever remaining staff and students were present, which he was. He would also, at some point during the quiet of December, go down to the room where the mirror had stood, it was being moved, Dumbledore had said, somewhere safer and less accessible, and stand in the spot where he'd seen himself and remember what his heart had shown him. Not the ministry departments, not the governance frameworks, not the 20 rings sitting in their cases in a Gringotts vault. Just himself. With people. Laughing. He was 11 years old and he had the largest inheritance in British magical history and controlling interests in 12 government departments and a prophecy that said he'd have to kill or be killed by a Dark Lord and a list of magical anchors to dark soul magic that needed destroying one by one over the course of years. He was also, specifically, someone who had eaten Christmas dinner with people who wanted him there and written a letter to a man in Azkaban and sat next to a grieving kid in the back of a bookshop and meant it, every single time. He thought that was probably the part that mattered most. He picked up his next letter and started writing.